Hey guys, tonight we journey to the greatest civilization that ever soared through the skies of our world. A realm where 40 families rode dragons like gods among mortals, where molten stone was shaped into roads that spanned continents, and where the very air shimmered with magic so powerful it could bend reality itself. This is the story of old Valyria, the freehold that ruled half the known world for 5,000 years, until in a single day it vanished beneath fire and ash, leaving only whispers and ruins. Their story is one of breathtaking rise and catastrophic fall, of power so absolute it challenged the gods themselves. So before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, get into your blanket, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. But first, let me share with you a fragment of what's to come, a glimpse into the final hours before everything changed forever. The morning of the doom began like any other in the great city of Valyria. 40,000 dragonlords woke in their floating palaces, suspended above the 14 flames by ancient sorcery. The air tasted of sulfur and sea salt, as it had for millennia. In the Great Pyramids, slaves worked the mines that fed the empire's endless hunger for gold and silver. Children of the dragonlord families practiced their high Valyrian lessons, dreaming of the day they would bond with their own winged mount. But deep beneath the city, in chambers carved from living volcanic rock, something stirred that had slumbered since the world was young. The fire mages felt it first, a tremor in the magical currents that powered their civilization. Ancient texts, written in scripts older than dragons themselves, began to glow with warnings no one alive could read. The very stones whispered of a debt that had come due, a price that must be paid for flying too close to the sun. By sunset, the greatest empire in the history of the world would be nothing but memory and ash, sunk beneath the waves of what men would call the smoking sea. But how did a civilization that conquered half the world, that tamed dragons and reshaped continents, meet such a complete and utter end? That mystery, that terrible and beautiful tragedy, begins 5,000 years earlier, in a harsh volcanic peninsula, where a few scattered tribes first heard the roar of dragons echoing from deep within the mountains. Tonight we uncover the complete story, from those first dragon riders to the final moments when dragonfire turned inward and consumed the very heart of their empire. Long before the first dragon ever spread its wings beneath a Valyrian banner, the peninsula that would become the heart of an empire was nothing more than a harsh, unforgiving landscape of volcanic peaks and ash-covered valleys. The 14 flames, those towering volcanic mountains that would one day power the greatest civilization the world had ever known, were then just smoking peaks that belched fire and poison into the gray sky. In those early days, perhaps 4,000 years before Aegon the Conqueror would set foot on Westerosi shores, the Valyrian Peninsula was home to scattered tribes of shepherds and miners. These were not the pale, silver-haired dragonlords of legend, but dark-haired nomads who eked out a brutal existence in the shadow of the ever-burning mountains. They worshipped gods of fire and shadow, leaving offerings of obsidian and volcanic glass at crude stone altars built near the mountain peaks. The land itself seemed hostile to human life. Rivers of molten rock carved channels through the black stone valleys. The air shimmered with heat even in winter, and strange vapors rose from cracks in the earth that could kill a man in minutes if he breathed too deeply. What little vegetation grew here was twisted and strange, fed by the mineral-rich soil but warped by the constant exposure to sulfur and flame. Yet it was precisely this hellish landscape that would give birth to the most powerful empire in history. For deep within the 14 flames, in caverns carved by flowing lava over countless centuries, dwelt creatures that had slumbered since the dawn of the world. Dragons, not the great beasts of later legend, but smaller, wilder creatures, their scales black as obsidian, their eyes like molten gold. They fed on the sulfur and heat of the volcanic depths, growing strong on the very forces that made the peninsula so deadly to ordinary men. The first discovery happened by chance, as so many world-changing events do. A shepherd named Gaemon, tending his hardy mountain goats near the peak of what would later be called Valerian's Cradle, heard a sound unlike anything he had ever experienced. Not the rumble of an eruption or the hiss of escaping steam, but something else entirely. A sound that seemed to resonate in his very bones, a call that spoke to something deep within his blood. Following that sound deeper into the mountain than any of his people had ever dared venture, Gaemon discovered a sight that would haunt his dreams and inspire his descendants for generations to come. In a vast cavern, lit by streams of flowing lava, he found them, dozens of dragons, some no larger than eagles, others the size of horses, their scales reflecting the firelight like precious gems. They moved through the superheated air as if it were their natural element, which indeed it was. But what happened next defied all logic and reason. Rather than flee or attack, the dragons seemed to recognize something in this mortal man. The largest of them, a magnificent creature with scales that shifted from deep red to molten gold, approached Gaemon without fear or aggression. When their eyes met, something passed between them, some spark of understanding that would echo through the ages. That night, Gaemon returned to his tribe riding on the back of a dragon. The discovery sent shockwaves through the scattered communities of the peninsula. Some called it sorcery, others a gift from the gods of fire and blood. But as more brave souls ventured into the volcanic depths following Gaemon's example, a pattern emerged. Not everyone could bond with the dragons. It required something specific in the blood, some quality that perhaps 1 in 100 possessed. Those who had it became the first dragon riders. Those who did not often became their first victims. Within a generation, these dragon riders had united the scattered tribes under their rule. Within a century, they had begun to look beyond their volcanic homeland to the wider world that lay across the narrow sea. The age of Valyrian expansion was about to begin, though none could foresee where that path would ultimately lead. The transformation of the Valyrian Peninsula from a collection of warring tribes into the foundation of an empire began with blood, fire, and the forging of bonds that would endure for millennia. In the century following Gaemon's first flight, the art of dragon bonding evolved from desperate experimentation into something approaching science, though it remained forever touched by mystery and magic. The early dragonlords discovered that the connection between human and dragon was not merely one of dominance and submission, but something far more profound. The bond required a sacrifice of blood, ritually offered in the heart of the volcanic chambers where the dragons made their lairs. But not just any blood would suffice. It had to come from those whose lineage carried the spark, the indefinable quality that allowed communion with creatures of fire and sky. As the decades passed, certain families emerged as more successful than others in producing dragon riders. These bloodlines began to intermarry, concentrating the necessary traits while carefully guarding the secrets of their success. The Targaryens, in those early days, were merely one family among many, distinguished neither by wealth nor by the size of their dragons. Far more prominent were houses whose names would later be lost to history, families like the Bellarys and the Corys, who commanded the largest dragons and held the most fertile valleys. The process of dragon bonding itself was both magnificent and terrifying to witness. A potential dragon rider would descend into the volcanic depths, often as young as 12 or 13 years old, carrying only a blade of volcanic glass, and their courage. The dragons, by this time accustomed to human presence, but still wild at heart, would test the newcomer in ways that often proved fatal. Many young aspirants never returned from those depths, consumed by dragon fire, or simply lost in the maze of lava tubes that honeycombed the mountains. Those who survived the initial encounter faced an even greater challenge. The bonding ritual required the human to cut their palm with the obsidian blade and press their bleeding hand against the dragon's scales, while speaking words in what would later be called High Valyrian, though the language was still crude and fragmented in those early days. If the dragon accepted the bond, the sensation was said to be like having molten gold poured directly into one's veins, a burning that transformed rather than destroyed. The first successful dragon riders found that their new mounts opened possibilities they had never imagined. Flight was just the beginning. Dragons could be trained to breathe fire on command, to carry riders across vast distances without rest, and most importantly for the future of Valyria, to wage war with devastating effectiveness. A single dragon could destroy an entire enemy village in minutes, and the psychological impact of these flying terrors was even more powerful than their physical capabilities. With dragons as their weapons, the early dragonlord families began to consolidate power across the peninsula. Rival tribes that had resisted unification for centuries suddenly found themselves faced with enemies who could strike from the sky without warning. Traditional fortifications, built to withstand sieges by ground forces, were useless against creatures that could simply fly over walls and rain fire on defenders. But conquest was only part of the dragon's value. They also proved invaluable for exploration and resource gathering. Dragon riders could scout vast territories in a single day, identifying deposits of precious metals and mapping terrain that would have taken ground expeditions months to explore. The dragons themselves seemed drawn to certain minerals, particularly those with magical properties, leading their riders to discoveries that would fuel Valyrian industry for millennia. The social structure of early Valyrian society began to crystallize around dragon ownership. Those families who possessed dragons naturally rose to positions of leadership, while those who could not bond with the great beasts found themselves relegated to supporting roles. This was not yet the rigid caste system that would later define the Valyrian freehold, but the seeds of that hierarchy were already being planted. Among the most successful of the early dragonlord families were the Valyrians, whose dragons showed particular affinity for the coastal regions and proved instrumental in early maritime expeditions. The Celtigars distinguished themselves through their dragons' unusual coloring and their riders' skill in aerial combat. House Cuheres commanded some of the largest dragons on the peninsula, great beasts whose wingspans could block out the sun. The Targaryens, though not yet prominent, began to show signs of the prophetic abilities that would later define their bloodline. Targaryen dragon riders reported strange dreams and visions, glimpses of possible futures that often proved remarkably accurate. Other families initially dismissed these claims as superstition, but as Targaryen predictions continued to come true, their counsel began to be sought on matters of importance. The dragons themselves were changing as well. Generations of bonding with humans had begun to alter their behavior and even their physical characteristics. They grew larger under human care, fed more regularly, and protected from the diseases that plagued their wild cousins. Their intelligence seemed to increase as well, as if the mental bond with humans was expanding their capacity for complex thought and communication. By the end of the first century of dragon domestication, the Valyrian peninsula had been completely transformed. Where once scattered tribes had eked out a harsh existence, now stood the beginnings of cities built from fused volcanic stone. The dragonlords had learned to shape and mold the black rock using dragonfire, creating structures of unprecedented strength and beauty. These early settlements bore little resemblance to the magnificent cities that would later crown the empire, but they represented the first flowering of Valyrian architectural genius. The 40 families that would eventually rule the freehold were beginning to take shape, though their final number and composition would not be established for several more centuries. Competition between these houses was fierce but generally respectful, bound by shared traditions and the practical necessity of cooperation in managing their dragon populations. Intermarriage between the families was common and encouraged, as it was believed that mixing bloodlines would strengthen the dragon bonding abilities of their offspring. Perhaps most significantly, The early dragonlords had begun to look beyond their volcanic homeland. Dragons were creatures of vast appetites, and the peninsula, for all its mineral wealth, could not indefinitely support a growing population of the great beasts. The narrow sea that separated Valyria from the eastern continent of Essos had begun to look less like a barrier and more like an invitation. Scouting flights had already revealed the existence of other lands, other peoples, and most tantalizing of all, other sources of wealth and power. The stage was set for the next phase of Valyrian expansion. Though none of the early dragonlords could have imagined the scale of the empire their descendants would build, or the terrible price that would eventually be paid for flying so high above the world of ordinary men. The first Valyrian ships to cross the narrow sea carried more than just explorers and traders aboard their vessels. They carried the future itself, though the crews manning those black-hulled ships could never have imagined the world-spanning empire their voyages would birth. It was Orion the Bold of House Coheres, whose dragon first flew reconnaissance over the eastern shores of Essos, returning with tales of fertile lands, wealthy cities, and most importantly, no dragons to contest Valyrian dominance. The initial expansion was cautious, almost tentative compared to the devastating campaigns that would later sweep across continents. The first permanent Valyrian settlement on Essos was established on a small island just off the coast, a strategic position that allowed for quick retreat if the mainland proved too hostile. From this modest foothold, dragonlord expeditions began to probe deeper into the strange new continent that lay before them. What they discovered exceeded their wildest expectations. The lands beyond the narrow sea were not the harsh volcanic wasteland of their homeland, but regions of incredible diversity and wealth. Rolling plains stretched to distant horizons, broken by great rivers that carried merchant ships laden with goods from far interior kingdoms. Ancient forests harbored trees of species unknown in Valyria, their wood prized for shipbuilding and construction. Most precious of all were the people themselves, skilled artisans and farmers, whose labor could be harnessed to fuel the growing Valyrian economy. The conquest of Tyrosh marked the true beginning of Valyrian expansion beyond their peninsula. This prosperous trading city, built on a cluster of islands in the narrow sea, had grown wealthy on the purple dye extracted from local sea snails. The Tyroshi had never faced an enemy that could attack from the sky, and their impressive fleet proved useless against dragons that could simply fly over their ships and set them ablaze with a breath of fire. The siege of Tyrosh lasted only 3 days. On the first day, House Valyrian's dragons destroyed the outer harbor defenses, their flames turning proud warships into floating funeral pyres. The second day saw the systematic destruction of the city's famous dye works, the economic heart of Tyroshi power. By the third day, the city's magisters had opened their gates and offered complete surrender rather than see their ancient home reduced to ash. The fall of Tyrosh sent shockwaves across the known world. Here was a power, unlike any that had come before, one that could project devastating force across vast distances with apparent ease. Diplomatic envoys from distant kingdoms began to arrive in Valyria, some offering tribute in hopes of avoiding conquest, others seeking alliance with these new masters of the sky. But the dragonlords had tasted victory, and their appetite for expansion grew with each success. Lys fell within the year, its famous pleasure houses and skilled artisans adding to the growing Valyrian economy. The conquest of Lys also provided the Valyrians with their first substantial population of slaves, captured soldiers and civilians, who would form the foundation of the massive slave system that would later power their empire. Mir proved more challenging than its neighbors, protected by innovative defensive measures that showed the free cities were learning to adapt to the threat of dragon attack. The Mirj had constructed great ballistae capable of launching iron-tipped bolts with enough force to wound even a dragon, and they had trained companies of archers to coordinate their fire against flying targets. For the first time since expansion began, the dragonlords faced meaningful resistance. The siege of Myr lasted 2 years and cost the Valyrians their first dragon in foreign conquest. Meraxes the Terrible, ridden by Visenya Coeres, was struck by a specially constructed ballista bolt that punched through her eye and into her brain, killing her instantly and sending both dragon and rider plummeting into the city's central square. The sight of a dead dragon, its magnificent scales already beginning to dull, sent a thrill of hope through the defenders and a chill of mortality through the attackers. But Visenya's death only intensified Valyrian determination. Her younger brother Aegon brought 5 more dragons from Valyria, along with specialists in siege warfare who had studied the Myrish defenses carefully. The renewed assault was devastating in its precision and ruthlessness. Every ballista was targeted and destroyed in coordinated strikes. The archer companies were scattered by precisely placed dragonfire that left buildings intact while incinerating their military defenders. When Myr finally fell, the Valyrians made an example that would be remembered for centuries. The city's ruling class was publicly executed by dragonfire, their ashes scattered to the winds as a warning to any who might consider resistance. But the craftsmen and artisans who had created Myr's famous metalwork were spared and transported back to Valyria, where their skills would contribute to the growing sophistication of dragonlord technology. The conquest of the 3 free cities provided the Valyrians with their first taste of administering distant territories. Unlike the peninsula, where dragonlord families could maintain direct control through proximity and personal relationships, these new possessions required different approaches to governance. The solution they developed would become the template for centuries of expansion. Each conquered city was placed under the rule of a Valyrian governor, always a member of one of the dragonlord families, supported by a garrison of Valyrian soldiers and at least 1 dragon. But rather than attempting to replace local customs and institutions entirely, the governors worked to integrate existing power structures into the growing empire. Local merchants who proved loyal were granted trading privileges. Artisan guilds that submitted willingly were allowed to maintain their internal organization while contributing their skills to Valyrian projects. Most significantly, the Valyrians began their systematic development of the slave economy that would define their empire. Prisoners of war formed the initial slave population, but the system quickly expanded to include debtors, criminals, and those simply unfortunate enough to be captured during raids. These slaves were not merely used for manual labor, though that remained their primary function. The most skilled were trained in specialized crafts, while the most intelligent were educated to serve as administrators and scribes. The economic benefits of expansion were immediately apparent in Valyria itself. Gold and silver flowed back to the peninsula in unprecedented quantities, allowing the dragonlord families to undertake construction projects that dwarfed anything previously attempted. The first great pyramids began to rise in the major Valyrian cities, their black stone blocks precisely cut and fitted, using techniques learned from conquered artisans and powered by dragonfire. Perhaps most importantly, the dragons themselves began to multiply. Fared better than they had ever been in their volcanic caves, protected from disease and injury by Valyrian care, and provided with secure nesting sites in the growing cities. The dragon population expanded rapidly. Young dragons, born in captivity and raised from hatching by their designated riders, proved even more tractable and intelligent than their wild court parents. The Valyrian road system, one of the most impressive achievements of their civilization, had its origins in this period of early expansion. Connecting the new territories to the homeland required reliable transportation routes, but traditional road construction across such distances would have taken decades and enormous resources. The solution was uniquely Valyrian. Using dragonfire to heat stone to precisely controlled temperatures, Valyrian engineers could fuse rock into seamless surfaces that required no mortar and would last for millennia. These fused stone roads became arteries of empire, carrying not just goods and soldiers, but ideas and innovations. Conquered peoples found themselves connected to a vast network of trade and communication that offered opportunities their isolated cities had never known. For many, Valyrian rule, despite its foundation in conquest, began to seem preferable to the constant warfare and instability that had characterized their previous existence. The cultural impact of expansion flowed both ways. As Valyrians established themselves in their new territories, they encountered technologies, art forms, and philosophical traditions that enriched their own civilization. The mathematical principles developed by Mirish scholars enhanced Valyrian engineering. Tyroshi textile techniques improved the clothing and tapestries that adorned dragonlord palaces. Lyciani musical traditions merged with Valyrian fire ceremonies to create new forms of religious expression. By the end of the first century of expansion, the Valyrian freehold controlled a substantial portion of the western coast of Essos. 3 major cities and dozens of smaller settlements acknowledged Valyrian authority, and the tribute they provided had multiplied the wealth of the dragonlord families many times over. The population of dragons had grown from the few dozen wild creatures originally found in the 14 Flames to nearly 200, with new hatchlings emerging every year. Yet this was merely the beginning. The success of the initial expansion had convinced the dragonlords that no force on Earth could stand against them. Scouts ranged ever further from the conquered territories, bringing back reports of vast empires to the east and south, rich in slaves and treasure. The ancient empire of Old Gears, the mysterious cities along the Jade Sea, even lands beyond the Bone Mountains where strange magics were said to flourish, all began to feature in the ambitious plans being drawn up in the council chambers of Valyria. The age of true imperial expansion was about to begin, and with it, the transformation of a regional power into the dominant force in the known world. 2 centuries after the first Valyrian ships crossed the narrow sea, the empire had grown beyond the wildest dreams of its founders. From the volcanic peaks of their homeland to the furthest shores of Slaver's Bay, the shadow of dragon wings fell across half the known world. This was the pinnacle of Valyrian power, an age when dragonlords walked the earth like gods and entire civilizations bowed before the might of fire made flesh. The city of Valyria itself had been transformed into something beyond human imagination. Where once rough stone buildings had hugged the volcanic slopes, now soared towers and pyramids that seemed to defy the very laws of nature. The greatest of these was the Pyramid of Valyria, a colossal structure that rose nearly 1,000 feet into the perpetually smoke-hazed sky. Its apex housed the Chamber of the 40, where the heads of the greatest dragonlord families gathered to decide the fate of nations. The chamber was a marvel of both engineering and artistry. 40 thrones, each carved from a single block of fused dragonstone and inlaid with precious metals from across the empire, formed a perfect circle around a central platform where speakers could address the assembled lords. Above, the ceiling was a masterwork of colored glass that filtered the light of the 14 Flames into patterns that shifted with the movement of the molten rock below. When all 40 dragons were present, perched on the landing platforms that surrounded the pyramid's peak, their combined presence created a spectacle that could be seen from hundreds of miles away. The wealth that flowed into Valyria during this golden age beggars description. Tribute ships arrived daily from across the empire, their holds laden with gold from the mines of Norvos, silver from the mountains beyond Kohor, precious stones from the Summer Isles, and rare spices from the mysterious lands of Yi-Ti. The harbors of Valyria grew to accommodate fleets of vessels so vast that their masts formed forests of wood and rope stretching to every horizon. But it was not merely material wealth that marked this as Valyria's golden age. The dragonlords had become patrons of learning and artistry on a scale never before seen in human history. The great library of Valyria housed nearly 1 million scrolls and books containing the accumulated knowledge of every civilization the empire had conquered. Scholars from across the known world competed for the privilege of studying within its halls, contributing their own discoveries to the vast repository of human understanding. Valyrian magic reached heights during this period that would never again be equaled. The glass candles that provided light without flame were perfected, casting a clean, bright radiance that never flickered or dimmed. Valyrian steel, that legendary metal stronger than any other substance known to man, was forged in quantities sufficient to arm entire legions. Most remarkably, the dragonlords learned to work with dragonglass on a scale that transformed their entire civilization. The secret lay in their mastery of temperature control through dragonfire. Different dragons, they discovered, could produce flames of precisely controlled heat, allowing artisans to work volcanic glass like clay. Entire buildings were constructed from shaped dragonglass, their walls translucent and shot through with veins of color that shifted with the light. Gardens enclosed in dragonglass conservatories bloomed with flowers from every corner of the empire, tended by slaves whose expertise had been acquired through conquest. The dragons themselves had evolved far beyond their wild ancestors. Through careful breeding programs that spanned centuries, the dragonlords had created distinct bloodlines optimized for different purposes. The war dragons were massive creatures whose flames could melt stone and whose scales could turn aside the finest steel. The swift courier dragons were smaller but capable of incredible speed, able to carry messages across the empire in a matter of days rather than months. Most prized of all were the great drakes, massive creatures whose size rivaled that of the later Balerion, the Black Dread, kept primarily for ceremonies and the most critical military campaigns. During this golden age, the dragon population reached its peak. Nearly 800 dragons served the 40 families, with young hatchlings being born every year. The dragon pit of Valyria, a massive amphitheater carved into the living rock of one of the 14 flames, could accommodate dozens of the great beasts simultaneously. Here, dragonlords would gather for the great festivals that marked the Valyrian calendar, their mounts performing aerial displays that were part celebration, part military demonstration, and part religious ceremony. The cultural achievements of this period matched the material ones. Valyrian poetry, written in the flowing script of High Valyrian, explored themes of power, destiny, and the relationship between mortal ambition and divine will. The epic poem, The Fires of Eternity, composed during this time, runs to nearly 50,000 lines and chronicles the rise of the first dragonlords in language so beautiful that even corrupted translations retain much of their power. Architecture reached new heights of ambition and artistry. The Valyrians perfected the technique of fusion building, using dragonfire to meld stone, metal, and glass into structures that seemed to grow from the earth rather than being built upon it. The great palaces of the dragonlord families became gardens of impossible beauty, with towers that spiraled into the sky like frozen flames and bridges that arced through the air without visible support. The governance of the empire during this golden age represented a careful balance between central authority and local autonomy. The 40 families ruled through a system that combined direct military control with sophisticated administrative structures. Each major city in the empire was governed by a dragonlord, but these governors were supported by extensive bureaucracies staffed largely by educated slaves and freed men whose loyalty was secured through a combination of reward and fear. The slave system that powered this golden age was perhaps the largest and most complex in human history. Millions of people labored in the mines, fields, and workshops that produced the empire's wealth. But this was not merely a system of brutal exploitation. The Valyrians had learned that skilled, well-treated slaves were far more productive than those driven by fear alone. The most capable slaves could earn significant privileges, and some even achieved positions of real authority within the imperial administration. The road system that connected the empire had grown into a marvel of engineering that facilitated not just trade and military movement, but cultural exchange on an unprecedented scale. The great Valyrian roads, their fused stone surfaces unmarked by centuries of use, carried more than goods and soldiers. They carried ideas, artistic techniques, religious concepts, and scientific discoveries across distances that had once isolated civilizations from one another. Trade during this golden age operated on a scale that would not be seen again until the rise of the modern world. Valyrian merchants, protected by the Empire's military might and facilitated by its infrastructure, established trading networks that reached from the frozen shores of Ib to the steaming jungles of Sorthorius. Gold from Casterly Rock, amber from the Shivering Sea, silk from Leng, all flowed through Valyrian channels, enriching the Empire and binding distant lands to its economic web. The religious life of the Empire during this period reflected both its power and its underlying anxieties. The traditional fire worship of the peninsula had evolved into an elaborate theology that placed the dragonlords at the center of divine purpose. They were not merely rulers according to the priests of the 14 Flames, but instruments of the gods themselves, chosen to bring order to a chaotic world through the purifying power of dragonfire. Yet even during this golden age, there were those who questioned whether such power could be maintained indefinitely. The Faceless Men, that mysterious cult of assassins, had emerged during this period, though their true purpose and origins remained hidden even from the dragonlords' extensive spy networks. Scattered throughout the Empire were those who whispered of ancient prophecies, of warnings written in languages older than Valyrian, of signs in the sky and tremors in the earth that spoke of coming doom. The dragons, for all their magnificence, required enormous resources to maintain. A single great drake consumed as much food in a day as a small village, and their need for specific minerals and magical components drove ever more ambitious mining operations deep into the 14 Flames. Some of the oldest dragonlords had begun to notice subtle changes in the volcanic system that powered their civilization, fluctuations in the magical currents that had once seemed as constant as the sunrise. But such concerns were easily dismissed during these golden years. The Empire's power seemed absolute, its expansion limited only by the edges of the known world. New territories were still being added to Valyrian control, new peoples were being brought into the imperial system, and new dragons were being born every year. The future stretched ahead like a great road of fused stone, straight and unending, carrying the heirs of the dragonlords toward a destiny that seemed assured. Looking back from the perspective of what would come after, historians would mark this golden age as the moment when Valyrian power reached its absolute peak. Never again would the Empire command such vast resources, such unquestioned authority, or such magnificent achievements. The seeds of what would eventually bring it all crashing down were already taking root, but they remained invisible beneath the overwhelming brilliance of dragons in flight and the glitter of gold tribute flowing endlessly toward the smoking peaks of the Valyrian homeland. The first signs that all was not well in the greatest empire the world had ever known appeared not in grand disasters or military defeats, but in small, seemingly insignificant events that most dismissed as temporary setbacks. A slave revolt in the copper mines of Gisca that took 3 dragons to suppress instead of 1. A trading expedition to the Jade Sea that returned with half its ships missing, and wild tales of storms that moved against the wind. Strange dreams that began to plague the younger generation of dragonlords, visions of ash falling like snow and the 14 Flames going dark. The Empire had grown so vast that problems in distant provinces could fester for years before reaching the attention of the 40 families. Communication, even with dragons carrying messages, took time across such enormous distances. By the time reports of unrest reached Valyria, what had begun as minor disturbances had often evolved into serious challenges to imperial authority. The efficiency that had once characterized Valyrian administration began to show strain under the sheer weight of governing half the known world. In the great silver mines of the disputed lands, something unprecedented occurred. A section of tunnels that had been producing steadily for over a century suddenly went dry, not gradually, as mines normally did, but overnight. When Valyrian engineers descended to investigate, they found the silver veins empty, as if the metal had simply vanished. More disturbing still, the rock itself had changed color, taking on a sickly greenish hue that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. The few slaves who had been working that section when the change occurred were found dead, their bodies unmarked, but their eyes turned completely white. The incident was hushed up, the mine sealed, and the official report blamed unstable tunneling techniques. But word spread among the mining communities, and with it came fear. Slaves began to whisper that the earth itself was rejecting Valyrian dominance, that the gods of the conquered peoples were finally answering their prayers for deliverance. Production in other mines began to suffer as workers grew nervous and suspicious of every unusual sound or smell in the depths. Meanwhile, in the great city of Volantis, the largest and wealthiest of Valyria's overseas possessions, political tensions were beginning to surface that would eventually tear the empire apart. The merchant princes who governed the city under Valyrian oversight had grown enormously wealthy from trade, but they chafed under the restrictions that prevented them from owning dragons or marrying into the true nobility. A faction led by Triarch Magan Koharis began quietly advocating for greater autonomy, arguing that Volantis contributed more wealth to the empire than it received in return. The Koharis family had always been ambitious, but they had previously channeled that ambition into loyal service to the empire. Magan's father had died fighting Dothraki raiders on the empire's eastern frontier, and his grandfather had been instrumental in establishing the trade routes that brought Yeti gold to Valyrian coffers. But Magan himself had grown up watching dragonlords half his age, and a tenth as capable command authority, simply by virtue of their bloodline, and resentment had gradually curdled into something approaching treason. His seditious ideas found fertile ground among the merchant classes throughout the eastern provinces. In Norvos, the wealthy bell founders spoke quietly of the fortunes they could make if freed from Valyrian taxation. In Korhor, the masters of the forge whispered that their steel was superior to anything produced in Valyria itself, if only they were allowed to compete openly. These were not yet open rebellions, but they represented a fundamental shift in the relationship between the imperial center and its provinces. The dragons themselves were beginning to show troubling signs. Several of the great war drakes had begun refusing to fly. Despite showing no obvious signs of illness or injury, they would eat normally, respond to their riders' commands on the ground, but would not take to the air regardless of threats or inducements. The dragon keepers were baffled, and their careful breeding records showed no precedent for such behavior. When one of the affected dragons finally did fly, 3 days after its initial refusal, it collapsed and died within hours of landing, its great heart simply stopping without warning. The incident prompted the first comprehensive study of dragon health in generations. What the investigators found was deeply disturbing. The dragons that had refused to fly showed signs of what could only be described as magical exhaustion, as if the mystical forces that allowed creatures of such enormous size to take wing were somehow being depleted. The condition appeared to be spreading, affecting both old dragons and young, and no treatment the Valyrian mages attempted seemed to slow its progress. Religious unrest had begun to surface across the empire as well. The fire worship that the Valyrians had spread along with their political control was facing challenges from older, indigenous belief systems that had never been fully suppressed. In the Summer Isles, priests of the ancient fertility goddesses began performing public ceremonies that drew enormous crowds despite official disapproval. The ceremonies themselves were not openly rebellious, but they represented a rejection of Valyrian spiritual authority that made the dragonlord governors deeply uncomfortable. More troubling were the new prophetic movements that seemed to spring up simultaneously in widely separated parts of the empire. From the free cities to the shores of Slavers Bay, street preachers appeared claiming to have received visions of a great catastrophe that would sweep away all earthly power. Their specific predictions varied, but certain elements remained constant. Fire would rain from the sky, the earth would split open, and the dragons would fall silent forever. These prophets were usually dismissed as madmen or troublemakers, but their message resonated with populations that had grown weary of imperial exploitation. The tax burden required to maintain the vast Valyrian military had grown crushing over the decades, and the constant demand for slaves to work the empire's mines and plantations had torn apart countless families. When charismatic speakers promised that divine judgment was coming for their oppressors, people listened. In Valyria itself, the first cracks were appearing in the unity that had held the 40 families together for centuries. The eastern families, whose dragons patrolled the trade routes to Yeti and beyond, had grown fabulously wealthy from commerce and were beginning to question why they should submit to the authority of families whose power was based on older, more traditional forms of military conquest. The northern families, responsible for defending against barbarian incursions from the Dothraki Sea, complained that they bore a disproportionate burden of military service while receiving less than their fair share of tribute wealth. These tensions came to a head during what became known as the Dispute of the Golden Throne, when the ancient seat of the council leader became vacant due to the death of Aerion Targaryen in a dragon-riding accident. 3 different families claimed the right of succession. The traditional rules of succession were unclear, having been established in simpler times when the empire was smaller and the stakes lower. For the first time in centuries, dragons faced dragons in the skies above Valyria itself, as the claimants sought to settle the matter through trial by combat. The battle was brief, but devastating. 2 dragons died, along with their riders, and a section of the city's ancient library was destroyed by wayward dragonfire. The conflict was eventually resolved through negotiation rather than force, but the precedent had been set. The bonds of tradition and mutual respect that had held Valyrian society together were weakening, and naked ambition was beginning to replace collective purpose. Economic problems were mounting as well. The empire's enormous military and administrative apparatus required constant funding, but the easily exploitable sources of wealth were becoming exhausted. Mine output was declining across the empire, not just due to the strange incidents in the disputed lands, but because the most accessible deposits had been worked out. Agricultural productivity was suffering under the environmental changes caused by massive mining and smelting operations, and the slave population was becoming increasingly costly to maintain as revolts became more frequent and better organized. The Faceless Men, always present but rarely seen, had begun to make their presence felt more directly. A series of unexplained deaths among mid-level imperial administrators had disrupted the smooth functioning of government in several provinces. The victims showed no signs of violence, no evidence of poison, no indication of how they had died beyond the simple fact that they were found dead in locked rooms with no sign of intrusion. The authorities suspected the mysterious assassins, but could prove nothing, and the fear of invisible killers began to affect the morale of the imperial bureaucracy. Perhaps most ominously, the magical infrastructure that supported Valyrian civilization was showing signs of instability. The glass candles that had provided clean, eternal light for centuries began to flicker and dim in buildings across the empire. The fused stone roads, supposedly permanent and indestructible, developed hairline cracks that appeared overnight and seemed to spread of their own accord. The great aqueducts that supplied water to Valyria's largest cities required increasingly frequent repairs as their ancient enchantments weakened. The 14 flames themselves were behaving strangely. The constant, predictable pattern of eruption and quiescence that had characterized them for millennia began to shift. Some peaks that had been active for centuries went dormant without warning, while others that had slept for generations suddenly came to life with unprecedented violence. The correlation between volcanic activity and magical power that the Valyrians had long taken for granted seemed to be breaking down, and the mages who monitored such things spoke in worried whispers of energies building toward some unknown release. Yet despite all these warning signs, the majority of Valyrians remained confident in their empire's permanence. They had weathered challenges before. They told themselves every great civilization faced periods of difficulty, but their dragons made them invincible, their magic made them supreme, and their destiny was written in dragonfire across the sky. The cracks in their foundation were still small, still manageable, still easily dismissed by those who preferred not to see them. The true test was yet to come. Along the mighty Rhoyne River, the greatest waterway in the known world, a civilization had flourished for thousands of years that possessed magic as powerful as dragonfire, though fundamentally different in its nature and application. The Rhoynar people were masters of water sorcery, able to call up great waterspouts from calm rivers, summon fog so thick it could hide entire fleets, and most remarkably, command the very currents themselves to serve their will. Their cities, built on islands and riverbanks, were marvels of engineering that worked with the water rather than fighting against it, and their knowledge of hydraulics and river navigation was unmatched anywhere in the world. For Princess Nymeria of Nysar, the approaching Valyrian threat represented more than just another military challenge. She was the heir to a tradition of river magic that traced its lineage back to the first days when her ancestors had learned to speak with the waters themselves. The great tower libraries of her people contained scrolls written in flowing script that seemed to move like water across the parchment, recording spells and techniques that had been refined over millennia. Unlike the Valyrians, who conquered through overwhelming force, the Rhoynar had always sought to understand and harmonize with the natural world around them. The initial Valyrian expansion into Rhoynar territory began not with conquest but with what appeared to be peaceful trade. Valyrian merchants, backed by small dragon escorts, established trading posts along the lower reaches of the Rhoyne, offering exotic goods from across their empire in exchange for the fine textiles and intricate metalwork for which the Rhoynar were famous. For several years this arrangement worked to the benefit of both peoples, and many Rhoynar leaders convinced themselves that accommodation with the dragonlords was possible. But the Valyrians had not come merely to trade. Their scouts mapped every channel and tributary of the great river system, noting defensive positions, population centers, and most importantly, the locations where Rhoynar water mages gathered to perform their rituals. Intelligence flowed back to Valyria detailing the strengths and weaknesses of a civilization that possessed the most sophisticated understanding of river warfare in human history. The war began over water rights, that most precious of resources in any river civilization. Valyrian settlements upstream began diverting water for their mining operations, reducing the flow that reached Rhoynar cities downriver. When diplomatic protests were ignored, Princess Nymeria authorized the first direct action against Valyrian interests. A trading fleet was surrounded by Rhoynar rivercraft during what appeared to be a routine fog bank, but the fog itself was a weapon called up by water mages and infused with properties that caused disorientation and panic among those caught within it. When the fog cleared, the Valyrian ships found themselves surrounded by hundreds of Rhoynar vessels that seemed to have materialized from the mist itself. The Rhoynar offered no violence to the crews, instead politely but firmly escorting them to shore and confiscating their cargoes as compensation for the diverted water. It was a masterful display of river magic that demonstrated Rhoynar capabilities without crossing the line into open warfare. The Valyrian response was swift and devastating. 3 dragons arrived within days, their flames turning the river itself into steam where they touched the water. But the Rhoynar were not helpless against fire from the sky. Their water mages called up great waterspouts that could reach high enough to threaten even flying dragons, and they had developed techniques for creating sudden violent rainstorms that could douse dragonfire or force flying creatures to seek shelter. The first major engagement of the war took place at the confluence of 3 great tributaries, where the ancient city of Volantharis controlled the river traffic for hundreds of miles in every direction. The Valyrians brought 5 dragons to the attack, confident that their aerial superiority would allow them to destroy the city's defenses quickly. But as the dragons approached, the very air around them seemed to thicken with moisture, making flight difficult and reducing visibility to mere yards. Suddenly, great geysers of water erupted from the river itself, reaching heights that no natural phenomenon could explain. The dragons found themselves fighting not just the Rhoynar military, but the river itself, which seemed to have awakened in defense of its children. One dragon, caught by a waterspout while flying too low, was pulled down into the churning water and held there until it drowned, its flames extinguished forever in the depths of the ancient river. The loss of a dragon to drowning shocked the Valyrian command. Their creatures were supposed to be supreme, immune to conventional warfare, yet here was proof that other forms of magic could challenge even dragonfire. The psychological impact rippled through the Valyrian forces, introducing doubt where absolute confidence had previously reigned. Princess Nymeria herself led the defense of her people's capital, the great city of Nysa, built on an island in the river's widest point. As Valyrian forces approached, she stood atop the city's highest tower and began the most ambitious waterworking in Rhoynar history. The river responded to her call, its currents shifting and accelerating until the water around the city moved like liquid glass, too fast and smooth for any ship to navigate safely. But the most remarkable aspect of her magic was how it seemed to communicate with the dragons themselves. As the great beasts flew over the transformed river, they became increasingly agitated, their flight patterns erratic, and their flames unfocused. Later, Valyrian dragonlords would theorize that the ancient river magic interfered with whatever mystical forces allowed dragons to fly, creating a dissonance that affected the creatures at a fundamental level. The siege of Nysa lasted for 3 months, longer than any Valyrian military operation in their history of expansion. Wave after wave of attacks was repelled by combinations of conventional defense and water magic that the dragonlords had never encountered. Fog would rise from the river without warning, concealing defensive positions and confusing attacking dragons. Rain would fall upward from the water's surface, extinguishing flames and soaking wing membranes until flight became impossible. Yet, despite their magical prowess, the Rhoynar faced a fundamental disadvantage in resources and numbers. The Valyrian Empire could call upon the wealth and manpower of half the known world, while the Rhoynar, however skilled, were limited to their river valley homeland. As the war dragged on, more dragons arrived from Valyria, along with legions of infantry and siege equipment that gradually overwhelmed Rhoynar defenses through sheer weight of numbers. The fall of Troyane, the festival city, marked the beginning of the end for Rhoynar resistance. This magnificent metropolis had been the cultural heart of their civilization, where the greatest water mages gathered each year to share knowledge and perform the elaborate ceremonies that maintained their connection to the river spirits. The city's defenses included not just walls and towers, but a series of canals that could be flooded or drained to channel attacking forces into killing grounds where water magic was most effective. But the Valyrians had learned from their earlier defeats. Instead of relying solely on dragonfire, they brought with them siege engines designed specifically for fighting water mages. Catapults hurled not stones but specially prepared substances that would burn even when wet, creating fires that could not be extinguished by conventional means. Most devastatingly, they had developed a technique for using dragonfire to superheat sand, creating glass projectiles that could shatter on impact and spread molten fragments across wide areas. The destruction of Troyane was total and absolute. The great libraries were burned, their water-stained scrolls turning to ash and steam. The temple complexes where generations of river priests had maintained their connection to the ancient spirits were reduced to fused glass and twisted metal. Most tragically, the sacred pools where young Rhoynar learned to communicate with the water spirits were deliberately poisoned with alchemical substances that would render them permanently toxic. Princess Nymeria watched the destruction from across the river, tears streaming down her face as the work of millennia was destroyed in a single day. But even in defeat, she began planning for survival. The Rhoynar could not match Valyrian military might, but they possessed something equally valuable. Their knowledge of river navigation and their portable water-working techniques would allow them to seek refuge in lands beyond Valyrian reach. The Great Migration that followed represented one of the most remarkable logistics achievements in human history. 10,000 ships, from great war galleys to simple fishing boats, gathered at secret locations along the river system. The Rhoynar loaded not just their people and possessions, but as much of their cultural heritage as could be transported: seeds from their sacred groves, stones from their holiest temples, and most importantly, young people trained in the water magic traditions that Valyria sought to destroy. As the evacuation fleet prepared to depart, Princess Nymeria performed one final act of river magic. Standing knee-deep in the waters of the Rhoyne, she called upon powers that her people had not used in over 1,000 years, magic so dangerous that it risked killing the wielder. The river responded with a fury that terrified even the Valyrians, rising in a great wave that swept away bridges, docks, and entire settlements that had been built along its banks. But this was not mere destruction. It was transformation. The river itself seemed to curse the land that the Valyrians had conquered, ensuring that it would never again provide the abundance it had given to the Rhoynar. Where once fertile fields had stretched between the water and the hills, now only salt marshes and poisoned ground remained. The Valyrians had won their war, but they had inherited a wasteland. The migration fleet disappeared into the sunset, carrying with them the last free practitioners of river magic, and the hope that Rhoynar civilization might survive in some new land beyond the reach of dragons. Their destination was unknown even to Princess Nymeria herself, chosen through water-scrying rituals that revealed only that salvation lay to the west, across waters no Valyrian ship had ever sailed. In the scorching deserts of eastern Essos, where the ancient cities of Slaver's Bay shimmered like mirages under the relentless sun, lay the last remnant of a civilization that had once rivaled even the growing might of Valyria. Old Gis, the legendary empire that had ruled these lands for 5,000 years before the first dragon ever flew, had been reduced to a shadow of its former glory, but it remained proud, defiant, and determined to resist the expanding influence of the dragonlords with every resource at its disposal. The Gizkari were heirs to military traditions that stretched back to the dawn of recorded history. Their ancestors had perfected the art of infantry warfare when the Valyrians were still barbarian shepherds, scratching out a living on their volcanic peninsula. The famous lockstep legions of Old Giz had conquered half of Essos through discipline, organization, and tactical brilliance that required no magic, no dragons, only the unwavering courage of men willing to stand shoulder to shoulder against any enemy. The great pyramids of Meereen, Yunkai, and Astapor were not mere monuments to vanity, but defensive structures designed by military engineers who understood siege warfare better than perhaps any people who had ever lived. Each pyramid was essentially a fortress, its broad base honeycombed with chambers that could house entire armies, its sloping sides designed to deflect siege engines and provide killing fields for defenders. The largest of these, the Great Pyramid of Meereen, rose over 800 feet into the desert sky and could shelter 50,000 people during a siege. At the heart of Gizkari military philosophy lay the concept of the perfect soldier, not perfect in the sense of superhuman ability, but perfect in training, discipline, and unwavering loyalty to the collective good. The Unsullied, those legendary warrior slaves who would later become famous throughout the known world, were the ultimate expression of this philosophy. Taken as children and subjected to training so rigorous that only 1 in 4 survived to adulthood, they emerged as fighters who knew no fear, felt no pain, and obeyed orders with absolute precision. The creation of an unsullied warrior began in early childhood, often with boys purchased from slave markets across Essos or taken as tribute from conquered peoples. The training regimen was designed not just to develop physical prowess, but to completely reshape the human spirit. Pain was their teacher, hunger their constant companion, and death their ever-present shadow. They learned to fight with spear and shield in formations so tight that 100 men could move as one, their bronze-capped spears creating an impenetrable hedge of steel that had broken cavalry charges and infantry assaults for centuries. But perhaps most remarkably, the Unsullied were trained to feel no sexual desire, no personal ambition, no loyalty to anything except their unit and their commanders. This was achieved through a combination of physical castration, psychological conditioning, and in some cases, carefully applied sorcery that numbed emotional responses while leaving tactical intelligence intact. The result was a soldier who could not be bribed, seduced, or intimidated, who would die before retreating and kill without hesitation or remorse. When the first Valyrian scouting expeditions reached the borders of Giscari territory, they found a civilization that was ready for them. Unlike the surprised cities of the Western Free Cities or the unprepared Roinar, the Giscari had been observing Valyrian expansion for decades, studying their tactics and developing countermeasures specifically designed to neutralize the advantage of dragonfire. The Giscari solution to dragons was characteristically methodical and practical. They could not match Valyrian magic, but they could engineer defenses that would minimize its effectiveness. Great ballista were constructed with bronze reinforcement that could withstand dragonfire long enough to launch their massive bolts. More importantly, they developed a tactic of fighting in covered formations, using overlapping shields and bronze-plated shelters to create protected spaces where infantry could operate even under dragon attack. The first of the 5 great wars between Valyria and Old Gis began when Giscari raiders struck Valyrian settlements along the coast of Slavers Bay, capturing hundreds of colonists and dragging them back to the slave markets of Astapor. This was not mere piracy, but a calculated provocation designed to draw Valyrian forces into terrain where Giscari advantages in ground warfare could be brought to bear. The Valyrian response was swift and overwhelming, or so it seemed. 40 dragons descended upon the Giscari coastal cities, their flames turning sand to glass and reducing wooden structures to ash within minutes. But the Giscari had prepared for exactly this scenario. As dragonfire rained from above, they retreated into underground tunnels and reinforced chambers that had been prepared years in advance. When the initial assault ended, they emerged to find their cities damaged but not destroyed, their military capabilities largely intact. What followed was a grinding campaign of attrition, unlike anything the Valyrians had previously experienced. The Giscari refused to meet them in open battle where dragons could be decisive, instead fighting from prepared positions, launching hit-and-run attacks, and forcing the dragonlords to conquer every mile of territory through costly ground assault. The desert itself became an ally to the defenders, its burning heat and lack of water sources making extended campaigns nearly impossible for forces accustomed to the temperate climate of Western Essos. The lockstep legions proved their worth again and again during these campaigns. Even when caught in the open by dragon attack, they maintained formation discipline that turned what should have been massacres into fighting withdrawals. Their bronze shields, specially treated with alchemical compounds, could deflect dragonfire long enough for the formation to reach cover. Their spears, longer than those used by other armies, could reach flying dragons that swooped too low, and their crossbows fired special bolts designed to penetrate dragon scales. But the most effective Giscari weapon against dragons was their patience. They were willing to fight a war that lasted decades, absorbing losses that would have broken other peoples while slowly bleeding the Valyrian forces through constant small-scale engagements. Every dragon killed or wounded was a victory that brought them closer to eventual triumph, while every Giscari legion destroyed could be replaced from the vast slave markets that formed the backbone of their economy. The Second War began when the Giscari launched a massive offensive designed to retake all the territory lost in the first conflict. This time, they had developed new tactics specifically for fighting dragons. Great nets made of bronze chain were spread between towers, creating aerial obstacles that could entangle flying creatures. Alchemical weapons that burned with smokeless flames were deployed to create areas of superheated air that made flight difficult or impossible. Most innovatively, the Giscari had begun training their own flying units, not dragons, which they could not tame, but great war eagles bred to enormous size and trained to carry warriors armed with long spears and incendiary devices. These eagles could not match dragons in size or firepower, but they were faster and more maneuverable, able to attack dragons from unexpected angles and retreat before retaliation was possible. The climax of the Second War came at the Battle of the Skahazaden, where the great river that fed the Giscari cities became the site of the largest military engagement in the history of both civilizations. 50 dragons faced a Giscari army of over 200,000 men, including 30,000 unsullied, arranged in perfect defensive formations along the riverbank. The battle lasted from dawn until sunset, a continuous roar of dragon fire, clashing bronze and human voices raised in war cries that could be heard for miles across the desert. The Giscari fought with a desperation born of the knowledge that defeat would mean the end of their ancient civilization, while the Valyrians pressed their attack with the fury of conquerors who had never before faced such stubborn resistance. When the sun finally set, the battlefield was littered with the dead of both sides. 7 dragons lay motionless on the sand, their great forms already attracting carrion birds, despite the heat that still radiated from their scales. But the Giscari had paid an even higher price. Nearly half their army was dead or wounded, and the survivors were scattered across the desert, their legendary discipline finally broken by losses too terrible to sustain. The Third War was briefer, but more vicious than its predecessors. The Giscari, weakened by their previous defeats but still defiant, adopted tactics of total warfare that horrified even the hardened Valyrians. They poisoned wells, burned cities rather than allow them to be captured, and turned their own slave populations into weapons by promising freedom to any who killed a Valyrian soldier. It was during this conflict that the Valyrians first encountered the true horror of fighting unsullied warriors in their homeland. These perfect soldiers fighting on ground they knew intimately and supported by a population that saw them as protectors rather than oppressors, proved nearly impossible to defeat in direct combat. Even when outnumbered and facing dragonfire, unsullied units would maintain formation until literally the last man, their bronze spears never wavering, their discipline never breaking. The Fourth War saw the introduction of new Valyrian tactics developed specifically for fighting the Giscari. Having learned that direct assault was too costly, the dragonlords began a systematic campaign of destroying the infrastructure that supported Giscari civilization. Aqueducts were melted, irrigation systems were buried under dragon fire-fused sand, and most devastatingly, the great libraries and temples that housed Giscari culture were deliberately targeted for destruction. This cultural warfare succeeded where military campaigns had failed. The Giscari could replace soldiers and rebuild cities, but the loss of their accumulated knowledge and artistic heritage was irreplaceable. Ancient texts that recorded the military wisdom of centuries were reduced to ash. Sculptures that had stood for millennia were melted into unrecognizable lumps of bronze and stone. The fifth and final war was less a military campaign than an execution. The Giscari resistance had been broken not by superior tactics or overwhelming force, but by the systematic destruction of everything that made their civilization worth defending. When the last great pyramid fell, when the final lockstep legion laid down its bronze spears in surrender, an empire that had endured for 5,000 years came to an end. Yet even in defeat, the Giscari left a legacy that would shape the future of the Valyrian Empire. The unsullied, those perfect soldiers created through suffering and discipline, were adopted wholesale into Valyrian military structure. The techniques of siege warfare developed during the long campaigns were incorporated into Valyrian tactical doctrine. Most importantly, the sheer difficulty of conquering Old Jiri's had taught the dragonlords that their empire was not invincible, that there existed forms of power that even dragons could not easily overcome. The greatest empire in human history began to tear itself apart not through external conquest or natural disaster, but through the corrosive poison of its own success. After centuries of expansion and victory, the 40 dragonlord families had accumulated such vast wealth and power that the bonds of cooperation which had once held them together began to strain under the weight of competing ambitions. What started as political disagreements in the council chambers of the Great Pyramid soon escalated into open warfare that would rage across the Valyrian heartland for nearly a century. The spark that ignited this devastating conflict came from an unexpected source. House Cuhurries, one of the most ancient and respected of the dragonlord families, had discovered something extraordinary in the deepest mines beneath their ancestral holdings. Not gold or silver, but deposits of a strange black mineral that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. When exposed to dragonfire, this substance produced flames of unprecedented intensity and duration, flames that burned with colors never before seen and could melt substances that had previously been considered fireproof. The discovery should have been reported to the Council of 40 according to ancient law, as all magical substances found within the freehold were considered common property of the Empire. But Lord Cuhurris made a fateful decision to keep the discovery secret, sharing the knowledge only with his closest allies among the northern houses. His reasoning was understandable given the political climate of the time. The eastern houses, grown wealthy from trade, had been using their economic power to influence imperial policy in ways that favored commercial interests over military ones. When rumors of the secret mine began to circulate, they triggered a cascade of suspicion and paranoia that had been building for decades. If House Cuhurries was hiding magical resources, what else might the great families be concealing from each other? The eastern houses, led by the ambitious Lady Visenya Belleri's, demanded a full investigation of all mining operations across the empire. The northern houses, seeing this as an attempt to seize their traditional military prerogatives, refused to cooperate. The situation exploded into violence when a team of inspectors sent by the Eastern Coalition was found dead at the entrance to a Cuhurries mine, their bodies bearing clear signs of dragonfire wounds. Each side blamed the other for the killings, and within days, dragons were in the air above Valyria itself, their riders shouting challenges and accusations across the smoke-filled sky. The War of Three Hammers, as historians would later name the first phase of the civil conflict, began when Lord Daemon Targaryen attempted to mediate between the feuding factions. The Targaryens had always maintained a carefully neutral position in inter-family politics, using their prophetic gifts to advise rather than command. But Daemon's efforts at peacemaking were seen as weakness by the more aggressive houses, and when he called for a formal conclave to resolve the dispute, both sides arrived with their full military retinues. The ancient amphitheater, where the conclave was held, had witnessed many heated debates over the centuries, but never anything like the chaos that erupted when Lord Cuhurries accused Lady Visenya Belleri's of orchestrating the mine murders. Before anyone could intervene, she had drawn her Valyrian steel blade and challenged him to personal combat. The fight that followed was brief but brutal, ending when Magor's superior sword skills left Visenya dying on the amphitheater floor. Her death cry was answered by the roar of her dragon, Vermithor the Bronze, who had been waiting outside the amphitheater. The great beast smashed through the ancient walls in a fury of grief and rage, its flames filling the chamber and forcing the assembled lords to flee for their lives. In the confusion, several more dragonlords were killed, either by dragonfire or in the stampede that followed, and any hope of peaceful resolution died with them. What followed was unlike any conflict the world had ever seen. Previous wars had been fought between Valyria and foreign enemies, but this was dragon against dragon, fire against fire, with the very heart of the empire as the battlefield. The great cities that had taken centuries to build became war zones where dragon fire lit the night sky, and the screams of the dying echoed off fused stone walls. The Northern Coalition, calling themselves the Steel Compact, controlled the traditional military strongholds and the ancient fortresses that guarded the approaches to the 14 Flames. Their dragons were primarily the great war drakes, massive creatures bred for battle, whose scales could turn aside enemy fire and whose own flames could melt bronze armor at 100 yards. Led by houses Cohris and Vassar, they fought with the disciplined tactics that had conquered half the known world. The Eastern Alliance, styling themselves the Golden Accord, possessed fewer dragons but controlled the Empire's economic infrastructure. Their strength lay in the swift courier drakes and the smaller but more maneuverable breeds that had been developed for exploration and trade protection. More importantly, they controlled the ports and trade routes that brought wealth from across the Empire, giving them resources to hire mercenary armies and purchase exotic weapons from distant lands. The third major faction emerged when the southern houses led by the ancient family of Valyria declared themselves neutral and attempted to protect the civilian population from the worst excesses of the war. They established refugee camps in the remoter parts of the peninsula and used their sea dragons to evacuate non-combatants to safety. This humanitarian effort earned them the gratitude of many common people, but the suspicion of both major factions, who saw neutrality as a form of betrayal. The fighting reached its most terrible intensity during what became known as the Year of Burning Rain. A massive aerial battle above the city of Valyria itself involved over 60 dragons, their combined flames creating thermal updrafts so powerful that they affected weather patterns across the peninsula. For months afterward, precipitation fell not as water, but as a fine ash mixed with droplets of molten glass, creating a hellscape where nothing could grow and breathing required constant protection. During this period, the mysterious affliction that had been affecting dragons throughout the Empire suddenly intensified. Entire bloodlines of dragons began refusing to fly, and some actively turned against their riders, as if the bonds that had held human and dragon together for millennia were dissolving under the stress of civil war. The Dragon Keepers reported behavior unlike anything in their records, with previously loyal mounts becoming erratic, aggressive, and in some cases completely uncontrollable. The most disturbing incident occurred when Balerion the Great, oldest and largest of all living dragons, simply disappeared. The ancient creature had been resting in his customary lair within the dragonlord when his keepers arrived one morning to find the vast chamber empty, with no sign of how something so enormous could have departed without being seen. Some claimed he had been killed and his body hidden, others that he had fled to some distant land, but many began to whisper that the great dragon had simply faded away, his life force depleted by the magical chaos consuming the empire. The Civil War's most lasting damage was not the cities destroyed or the lives lost, but the systematic breakdown of the institutions that had made Valyrian civilization possible. The great libraries where the accumulated knowledge of ages was stored became battlegrounds where priceless scrolls were used as kindling for dragonfire. The workshops where Valyrian steel was forged were abandoned as their masters fled or died, taking their secrets with them. Most tragically, the careful breeding programs that had produced the Empire's dragons were disrupted as bloodlines were scattered or deliberately destroyed by rival factions. Religious authority collapsed as the Fire Priest took sides in the conflict, with some supporting the Steel Compact's claims to traditional legitimacy, while others backed the Golden Accord's promises of reform. The great temples that had served as neutral ground for centuries became fortresses, their sacred fires burning not in worship but as beacons for military communications. The unified faith that had bound the Empire together fractured into competing sects, each claiming divine favor for their chosen faction. The war's most bizarre episode was the dancing plague that swept through Valyria during the conflict's 4th year. Thousands of people, seemingly at random, were seized by an irresistible compulsion to dance, continuing without rest until they collapsed from exhaustion. The affliction struck dragonlords and slaves alike, affecting entire districts of the great cities and making normal life impossible in the affected areas. Some blamed enemy sorcery, others saw it as divine punishment, but the true cause was never determined before the plague mysteriously ended as suddenly as it had begun. Economic collapse followed inevitably as trade routes were disrupted and the infrastructure of empire crumbled. The great roads that had carried goods across continents became dangerous paths where bandits preyed on travelers while dragons battled overhead. The elaborate financial systems that had managed the wealth of half the world broke down as different regions fell under the control of competing factions, each issuing their own currency and rejecting the authority of their rivals. Foreign enemies began to take notice of Valyrian weakness. The free cities, long cowed by dragonlord supremacy, started to assert their independence more boldly. Pirate fleets that had once fled at the sight of dragon wings now raided Valyrian shipping with impunity. Most ominously, intelligence reports spoke of strange stirrings in distant lands, of old enemies gathering strength and new threats emerging from the furthest corners of the known world. The war finally began to wind down, not through victory by any faction, but through simple exhaustion. The dragon population had been reduced by more than half, with many of the greatest and most ancient bloodlines lost forever. The human population of the peninsula had been devastated by years of warfare, famine, and disease. The magical resources that powered Valyrian civilization were showing signs of severe depletion, with even simple enchantments requiring enormous effort to maintain. A fragile peace was eventually negotiated through the intervention of the few remaining neutral houses, led by the Targaryens, whose prophetic gifts had given them glimpses of even greater disasters to come if the fighting continued. The Treaty of Smoking Stones established new boundaries of influence among the surviving factions and created mechanisms for resolving future disputes without resorting to dragonfire. But the damage had been done. The unity that had made Valyrian expansion possible was broken, replaced by suspicious cooperation that could collapse at any moment. The empire still existed, still controlled vast territories, still commanded the loyalty of millions of subjects, but it was no longer the invincible colossus that had once dominated the known world. The seeds of its ultimate destruction had been planted in the ashes of its own civil war, and they were already beginning to sprout in the darkness beneath the 14 flames. In the aftermath of the devastating civil wars, the Valyrian freehold entered what historians would later recognize as its final century of existence, though none alive at the time could have imagined that the greatest empire in human history had so little time remaining. The exhausted dragonlord families, their numbers decimated and their unity shattered, attempted to rebuild their civilization while ignoring the ominous signs that their magical foundations were crumbling beneath them. The immediate priority was restoring the empire's military strength, not just to maintain control over distant provinces, but to defend against the growing boldness of enemies who had noted Valyrian weakness during the civil wars. The Dothraki hordes on the eastern frontiers had begun launching raids deeper into imperial territory, their swift horsemen striking settlements that had known peace for centuries before vanishing back into the grasslands. More disturbing were reports from the far south, where the mysterious shadowlands beyond Ashai were said to be stirring with activity that defied explanation. Lord Aerys Targaryen, whose prophetic dreams had helped end the civil wars, became increasingly troubled by visions that seemed to show the empire's future. Unlike the clear glimpses of coming events that had made his family's reputation, these new dreams were chaotic and contradictory, filled with images of fire consuming fire and dragons falling silent forever. When he attempted to share these warnings with the Council of 40, he found his concerns dismissed as trauma from the recent conflicts rather than genuine prophecy. The dragon population had been reduced from its pre-war peak of nearly 800 to fewer than 400. and many of these were young, untested creatures who had never bonded properly with their intended riders. The careful breeding programs that had produced distinct bloodlines optimized for different purposes lay in ruins, with many genetic lines lost forever when their keepers died in the fighting. Attempts to rebuild these programs faced the additional challenge that many surviving dragons showed reluctance to mate, as if some instinct warned them against bringing new life into an increasingly dangerous world. More troubling still was the behavior of the surviving great drakes, the massive creatures who had been the backbone of Valyrian military power for centuries. These ancient beasts, some of whom had lived for over 200 years, began displaying signs of what could only be described as depression. They would lie motionless for days at a time, refusing food and showing no interest in flight, even when their riders commanded them. Several of the greatest dragons simply flew away one night and never returned, abandoning bonds that should have lasted until death. The economic recovery proved equally challenging. The vast trade networks that had enriched the empire for centuries had been disrupted by years of warfare, and many overseas territories had used the chaos to assert their independence or align themselves with rival powers. The free cities, while nominally still part of the empire, increasingly acted as independent entities, remitting tribute only when dragon-backed expeditions arrived to collect it by force. The great mines that had provided the raw materials for Valyrian industry were showing signs of exhaustion that went beyond normal depletion. Shafts that had produced steadily for centuries began yielding strange ores that crumbled to dust when exposed to air, or worse, metals that seemed to actively resist being shaped by traditional smithing techniques. Most disturbing were the reports from the deepest excavations, where miners spoke of hearing sounds that had no earthly source, voices speaking in languages that predated human civilization. The 14 flames themselves were behaving in ways that contradicted centuries of careful observation and documentation. The predictable cycles of eruption and dormancy that had allowed Valyrians to harness their power were becoming increasingly erratic. Some peaks that should have been active according to all historical patterns remained stubbornly cold, while others erupted with unprecedented violence at unexpected times. The correlation between volcanic activity and magical power that formed the foundation of Valyrian sorcery was breaking down, leaving the Empire's mages struggling to maintain even basic enchantments. Religious crisis accompanied the physical decline. The fire priests who had served as spiritual guides for the Empire found their connection to the sacred flames weakening. Prophecies that had once come clearly through ritual fire gazing became murky and contradictory. The great ceremonial braziers that had burned continuously for over 1,000 years began to flicker and dim, requiring constant attention to maintain. Some priests reported that the flames themselves seemed to whisper warnings, speaking of debts that must be paid and prices that could no longer be deferred. The faceless men who had operated in the shadows throughout Valyrian history became increasingly bold in their activities. A series of high-profile assassinations targeted not just political leaders but also the keepers of crucial knowledge, the master smiths who maintained the secrets of Valyrian steel, the dragon keepers who understood the ancient bonds between human and beast, and the sorcerers who powered the Empire's magical infrastructure. Each death was a small wound in the Empire's body of knowledge, and collectively they represented a systematic campaign to weaken Valyrian civilization from within. Despite these mounting problems, the dragonlord families continued to maintain the facade of imperial strength. Grand festivals were held to celebrate military victories that were actually costly Pyrrhic affairs. New construction projects were announced to demonstrate economic vitality, even as the funds to complete them came from increasingly desperate taxation of already struggling provinces. The great pyramids of Valyria continued to reach toward the sky, but many who looked closely could see hairline cracks spreading through their fused stone walls. The Empire's intellectual life suffered perhaps the most severe decline. The great libraries that had once attracted scholars from across the known world became neglected repositories, where dust gathered on scrolls that no one had the time or interest to read. The systematic research programs that had driven Valyrian technological advancement were abandoned in favor of desperately searching through ancient texts for quick solutions to immediate problems. Knowledge that had taken centuries to accumulate was being lost faster than it could be preserved. International relations grew increasingly tense as former allies began to question Valyrian reliability. The elaborate system of mutual defense treaties that had protected imperial territories required the empire to demonstrate strength it no longer possessed. When Tyrush was threatened by a coalition of pirates and mercenaries, the Valyrian response was slow and inadequate, requiring 3 times as many dragons as such an operation should have needed, and resulting in damage to the city that took years to repair. The slave system that had provided much of the empire's labor force was becoming unstable as well. Revolts that had once been quickly suppressed now required major military operations to contain, and even successful suppression left regions so devastated that their economic productivity was permanently reduced. More subtle but equally dangerous was the spread of religious movements among the slave populations, belief systems that promised liberation through divine intervention and encouraged coordinated resistance to their masters. The most ominous development of this final century was the emergence of what the Valyrians termed the silent zones, areas where magic simply stopped working. These dead spaces appeared first in the remoter parts of the empire, but gradually began spreading toward the heartland itself. Within these zones, dragons could not fly, Valyrian steel lost its supernatural sharpness, and even simple fire-starting spells failed to function. The zones seemed to appear randomly, without warning, and showed no signs of being reversible through any known means. Communication across the empire, once facilitated by dragon-carried messages and magical sending stones, became increasingly unreliable. Messages sent by dragon often failed to arrive, with the great beasts sometimes returning without their riders, and no explanation for what had happened to them. The magical communication networks that had allowed instant coordination across vast distances flickered in and out of operation, creating periods where the imperial capital lost contact with entire provinces for weeks at a time. Cultural production during this period reflected the empire's underlying anxiety. The poetry and art that emerged from the late Valyrian period was marked by themes of impermanence, decline, and approaching doom. The great epic, The Fires of Eternity, was revised during this time to include a new conclusion that spoke of flames that would eventually consume themselves, leaving only ash and memory. Musical compositions became increasingly complex and dissonant, as if the harmony that had once characterized Valyrian culture was breaking down along with everything else. The merchant classes, who had grown wealthy during the empire's expansion, began quietly moving their assets to safer locations. Gold flowed out of Valyria toward the free cities and beyond, carried by trading expeditions that departed with great fanfare, but returned with empty holds and reports of markets that were no longer profitable. Some of the wealthiest families began purchasing properties in distant lands, ostensibly for business purposes, but clearly as potential refugees should conditions in the homeland deteriorate further. Military recruitment became increasingly difficult as the traditional sources of soldiers proved inadequate. The citizen soldiers, who had once formed the backbone of Valyrian armies, were needed to maintain order in the face of growing domestic unrest. Mercenary companies demanded higher and higher fees for their services, and many proved unreliable when faced with the strange phenomena that were becoming commonplace across the empire. Even the legendary Unsullied, those perfect soldiers acquired from the conquest of Old Giz, seemed less effective than they had been in previous generations. The final decades before the Doom saw a series of increasingly desperate attempts to restore the Empire's former glory. Massive expeditions were launched to explore the farthest reaches of the known world, seeking new sources of wealth and magical power. These ventures consumed enormous resources and achieved little, often returning with tales of empty cities, dead lands, and seas that boiled without heat. Some expeditions never returned at all, vanishing into the vast unknown as completely as if they had never existed. The dragon population continued its inexorable decline. Fewer eggs were hatching each year, and those that did often produced creatures that were weak, malformed, or simply wrong in ways that defied description. The great dragon pit of Valyria, once home to dozens of magnificent beasts, echoed with emptiness as more and more of its chambers stood vacant. The remaining dragons seemed to sense the approaching end, their behavior becoming increasingly erratic and their bonds with their riders growing ever more tenuous. As the final century drew to a close, the Valyrian freehold resembled nothing so much as a magnificent facade concealing a crumbling foundation. The great pyramids still reached toward the sky, the roads still carried trade across continents, and the dragons still flew above the smoking peaks of the 14 flames. But those with eyes to see could observe the signs of approaching catastrophe in every aspect of imperial life. The greatest civilization in human history was preparing unknowingly for its final act upon the stage of the world. Among all the dragonlord families of Valyria, none possessed a gift more precious or more cursed than House Targaryen's ability to glimpse the threads of fate itself. For generations, Targaryen dreamers had served as advisors to the freehold, their prophetic visions helping to guide imperial policy and avoid disasters that might otherwise have befallen the empire. But in the reign of Lord Aena Targaryen, this gift would become both salvation and torment, leading to a decision that would preserve the Targaryen bloodline while condemning them to witness the destruction of everything they held dear. Daenerys Targaryen was 12 years old when the dreams began, arriving with the sudden intensity that marked true prophetic sight rather than the ordinary nightmares of childhood. Unlike the controlled visions that her ancestors had experienced during formal scrying rituals, these dreams came unbidden, often in the middle of the day while she went about her normal activities. She would suddenly freeze in place, her violet eyes staring at something no one else could see, while tears streamed down her face and her lips moved soundlessly, as if she were trying to warn someone of approaching danger. The first dream she was able to describe coherently came during a family feast celebrating the successful suppression of a slave revolt in the eastern provinces. As the assembled Targaryens raised their goblets in toast to imperial victory, Daenerys suddenly stood and spoke, in a voice that seemed to come from someone much older than her young body. She described the great city of Valyria in flames, not the controlled flames of dragon fire or volcanic forge work, but a consuming fire that devoured stone and flesh alike. She spoke of dragons falling from the sky like burning stars, their ancient magic finally exhausted. Most terrifying of all, she described the 14 flames themselves turning inward, their volcanic fury consuming the very heart of the empire in a single day of unimaginable destruction. The reaction to her prophecy was mixed. Some family members dismissed it as the product of an overactive imagination, influenced by the various doomsayers who had been appearing throughout the empire in recent years. Others, remembering the accuracy of previous Targaryen visions, urged caution and further investigation. Lord Attenor himself was torn between his paternal instinct to protect his daughter from the burden of such terrible knowledge, and his responsibility to take her warning seriously. As the months passed, Daenerys's visions became more frequent and more detailed. She began to see not just the destruction itself, but the events leading up to it. She witnessed failed harvests caused by ash from unprecedented volcanic activity. She saw dragon eggs that would never hatch, their shells cracking to reveal nothing but dust and disappointment. She observed the great libraries burning as panicked scholars fought to save scrolls that crumbled at their touch. Most disturbing of all, she dreamed repeatedly of a date, still years in the future, when all of this would come to pass in a single catastrophic day. The dreams were taking a terrible toll on the young girl. She grew pale and thin, often refusing food for days at a time because the act of eating reminded her of the famine she had seen in her visions. Sleep became elusive, as closing her eyes often triggered new prophetic episodes that left her exhausted and shaken. Her tutors reported that she would sometimes break down in tears during lessons, overwhelmed by the knowledge of how temporary all their careful learning would prove to be. Lord Einar consulted with the most learned mages and priests in Valyria, seeking some way to ease his daughter's burden or at least verify the accuracy of her visions. The fire priests confirmed that her descriptions matched their own increasingly dark readings of the sacred flames, while the College of Mages admitted that their magical researches were revealing dangerous instabilities in the volcanic system that powered their civilization. Most convincingly, several of Danis's shorter-term predictions began to come true with unsettling accuracy. The decision to take the dreams seriously was made when Danis correctly predicted the sudden death of a dragon that had shown no previous signs of illness. Vermithor the Bronze, one of the mightiest drakes in the Targaryen stable, collapsed and died exactly as she had foreseen at precisely the time she had specified. The dragon's death was followed by a series of minor volcanic eruptions that matched her visions in every detail, convinced even the skeptics that her gift was genuine. Preparing for the Exodus proved to be one of the most challenging undertakings in Targaryen history. They could not simply announce their intention to abandon Valyria, as such an action would be seen as treason against the freehold and might prompt other dragonlord families to demand explanations they could not provide without seeming mad. Instead, they had to begin quietly liquidating their assets and making preparations for a journey to the western edge of the known world, while maintaining the appearance of complete loyalty to the Empire. The selection of Dragonstone as their destination was based on another of Danis's visions, one that showed the ancient Valyrian outpost as a place of safety, where dragons could survive the coming catastrophe. The fortress had been built centuries earlier as a staging point for potential expansion into Westeros, but political changes in the Empire had led to its abandonment except for a small garrison. Its remote location and defensible position made it perfect for their purposes, while its Valyrian construction would allow them to maintain their traditional way of life even in exile. Convincing the family to undertake such a drastic action required all of Lord Einar's diplomatic skills and considerable courage. Many Targaryens had roots in Valyria that stretched back over 1,000 years, with ancestral homes, burial grounds, and business interests that seemed impossible to abandon. The older generation, in particular, struggled to accept that everything they had worked to build would soon be reduced to ash and memory. Some accused Einar of cowardice, suggesting that a true dragonlord would remain to fight whatever threats might emerge rather than fleeing to safety. The process of selecting which dragons to take presented its own challenges. The Targaryens possessed dozens of dragons of various sizes and ages, but the journey to Dragonstone was long and dangerous, requiring creatures that were strong enough to make the flight while carrying riders and essential supplies. After much deliberation, they chose 5 of their finest dragons, Balerion the Black Dread, already showing signs of the enormous size he would eventually attain, Vigar, swift and fierce despite her relatively young age, Meraxes, known for her intelligence and loyalty, and 2 smaller drakes that would serve as scouts and messengers. The selection of personnel proved equally difficult. The Targaryen household included hundreds of retainers, craftsmen, and slaves whose skills would be essential for establishing their new home. But the ships available for the journey could only carry a fraction of their people, forcing agonizing decisions about who would be invited to join the Exodus and who would be left behind to face whatever fate awaited Valyria. Priority was given to dragon keepers, smiths capable of working Valyrian steel, and scholars who carried knowledge that could not be replaced. The actual departure had to be choreographed carefully to avoid suspicion. Rather than leaving all at once, which would have been impossible to conceal, the Targaryens implemented a gradual withdrawal that took place over several months. Small groups of family members departed on seemingly routine business trips to various parts of the empire, eventually making their way to secret rendezvous points where ships waited to carry them west. The dragons left in similar fashion, participating in normal patrol duties before simply failing to return to their home base. Lord Anana himself was among the last to leave, maintaining the illusion of normal activity until the very end. His final act before departing was to place the Targaryen seal and family records in a vault deep beneath their ancestral home, along with a letter explaining their actions for any who might discover it after the doom. The letter expressed his hope that their departure would be seen not as abandonment but as preservation, an attempt to ensure that some remnant of Valyrian civilization would survive whatever catastrophe was approaching. The journey to Dragonstone proved harrowing in ways that even Daenerys' visions had not fully prepared them for. Storms arose seemingly from nowhere, forcing the dragons to fly through winds that threatened to tear them from the sky. Several ships in their small fleet were lost to what appeared to be random disasters, their crews and passengers vanishing beneath waves that had been calm moments before. The very air seemed to resist their westward progress, as if unseen forces were attempting to prevent their escape. When they finally reached Dragonstone, the ancient fortress seemed to welcome them like a refuge prepared by fate itself. The dormant volcanoes that heated the island showed signs of renewed activity, as if awakening in response to the presence of dragons and their riders. The castle's dragon pit, empty for decades, seemed to stretch and expand to accommodate their aerial mounts. Most remarkably, the dragon glass windows throughout the structure began to glow with their own inner light, providing illumination without any visible source of flame. The establishment of their new home required all the skills and determination that had made their family great. They rebuilt the abandoned sections of the castle, established new dragon roosts in the volcanic caves beneath the island, and began the complex process of creating a self-sufficient society far from the empire that had nurtured them. The dragons adapted to their new environment with surprising ease, as if they too sensed that this remote island would be their sanctuary in the dark times ahead. As years passed, and no word came from Valyria, the Targaryens found themselves living in a strange state of suspension between grief and relief. They had saved themselves and their dragons from destruction, but at the cost of becoming exiles from the greatest civilization in human history. Daenerys, now growing into womanhood, continued to experience prophetic dreams, but these showed not the past they had abandoned, but the future they would help to build in this new land across the narrow sea. In the decades leading up to the doom, the Valyrian freehold was plagued by an unprecedented surge of prophetic voices, each crying out warnings that the empire's leaders increasingly chose to ignore. These were not the controlled, ritualistic prophecies that had guided imperial policy for centuries, but wild, desperate visions that emerged from every level of society. Slaves working in the deepest mines spoke of hearing voices in languages that predated human civilization. Merchants reported dreams of their cargo ships sailing through seas of liquid fire. Even the youngest children in the great families began drawing pictures of dragons falling from burning skies, their innocent artwork displaying a disturbing consistency that their parents found deeply unsettling. The most prominent of these seers was a former fire priest named Batilon, who had served in the great temple of Valyria for over 40 years before his visions drove him to abandon his position and wander the empire as a street preacher. Unlike many of the doomsayers who had appeared in recent years, Batilon possessed detailed knowledge of Valyrian history and theology that lent credibility to his increasingly frantic warnings. He spoke not in riddles or metaphors, but in precise descriptions of geological processes and magical theory that only someone with deep understanding of the empire's foundations could possess. Badelon's most chilling prediction concerned what he called the Great Reversal, a catastrophic event in which the magical forces that had powered Valyrian civilization for millennia would suddenly turn destructive. According to his calculations, which he derived from careful study of ancient texts and observation of current volcanic activity, the 14 flames were approaching a state of magical saturation that could only end in explosive release. He compared it to a wine cask that had been filled beyond its capacity, with pressure building until the container itself would be destroyed by what it could no longer contain. The accuracy of his shorter-term predictions began to worry even the most skeptical observers. He correctly foretold the exact timing of several minor volcanic eruptions, the failure of specific magical devices throughout the Empire, and most remarkably, the spontaneous death of dragons that showed no previous signs of illness. When his prediction that 7 dragons would die on the same day across different parts of the Empire proved correct down to the hour, even some members of the Council of 40 began to wonder if his warnings about ultimate catastrophe might also be accurate. The geological signs that Belon interpreted as harbingers of doom were becoming impossible to ignore, even for those who preferred to dismiss prophetic warnings as superstition. The 14 flames had begun exhibiting behavior that contradicted everything Valyrian scientists thought they understood about volcanic systems. Lava flows that should have cooled within days remained molten for months, their temperatures actually increasing over time rather than diminishing. Underground chambers that had been stable for centuries suddenly shifted or collapsed without warning, creating sinkholes that swallowed entire city blocks and revealed caverns filled with gas that glowed with its own eerie light. Most disturbing were the reports from the deep mining operations that provided much of the Empire's wealth. Excavation teams working at the greatest depths began encountering chambers that seemed to have been carved by intelligence rather than natural geological processes. These spaces were filled with air that hummed with barely contained energy and walls covered in markings that resembled no known script. Some miners reported hearing what sounded like vast machinery operating somewhere even deeper beneath the earth, producing rhythmic vibrations that seemed to synchronize with the heartbeats of those who listened too long. The faceless men, who had operated in the shadows throughout Valyrian history, emerged from their traditional secrecy to make their presence felt more directly than ever before. Their campaign of strategic assassinations reached a fever pitch in the final years, targeting not just political leaders, but also the keepers of essential knowledge. Master smiths, who understood the forging of Valyrian steel, died in their workshops under mysterious circumstances. Dragon keepers, who maintained the bonds between riders and their mounts, vanished without explanation. Most critically, the mages who monitored and maintained the magical infrastructure of the Empire found themselves systematically eliminated by killers who left no trace of their methods or motives. The pattern of these killings suggested a coordinated effort to weaken the Empire's ability to respond to crisis, though the faceless men's ultimate goals remained as mysterious as ever. Some theorized that they were agents of a foreign power preparing for invasion. Others believed they were religious fanatics seeking to destroy what they saw as an affront to the natural order. A few whispered that they might be something else entirely, servants of forces that existed beyond human understanding and that viewed the Valyrian Empire as an obstacle to some greater purpose. The dragons themselves became increasingly unreliable as the final years approached. Ancient bonds that had held firm for centuries began to weaken without explanation. Dragons would refuse to obey their riders' commands, sometimes in mid-flight, forcing emergency landings that often resulted in injury or death. Others would fly away from Valyria entirely, abandoning their traditional roosts to seek refuge in distant lands where they might never be found again. The great dragon pit that had once housed hundreds of magnificent creatures echoed with emptiness as chamber after chamber stood vacant. Perhaps most ominously, some dragons began to exhibit signs of what could only be described as prophetic behavior. They would refuse to fly over certain areas weeks before geological surveys revealed instability in those regions. They would gather at specific locations and remain there for days at a time, as if waiting for something that only they could sense approaching. Some observers reported that the dragons seemed to be communicating among themselves using methods that went beyond their normal vocalizations, coordinating their actions in ways that suggested they possessed knowledge their human riders lacked. The economic infrastructure of the empire was crumbling under pressures that seemed to multiply faster than they could be addressed. Trade routes that had functioned reliably for centuries suddenly became dangerous as ships reported navigational instruments that spun wildly without cause and weather patterns that defied all previous experience. Cargo that had been perfectly preserved when loaded would arrive at its destination reduced to dust or transformed into substances that served no useful purpose. The great merchant houses that had grown wealthy facilitating trade across the empire began quietly relocating their operations to distant cities, claiming business opportunities that everyone understood were actually escape routes. Religious panic spread through all levels of society as the traditional fire worship that had bound the empire together began to fail in fundamental ways. The eternal flames that had burned in temples for over 1,000 years flickered and dimmed despite the constant attention of their keepers. Sacred rituals that had reliably produced prophetic visions now yielded only confusion and terror. Most disturbing of all, some priests reported that the flames themselves seemed to be trying to communicate warnings, forming shapes and patterns that spelled out messages of approaching catastrophe in languages that no living person could read. The systematic breakdown of magical infrastructure accelerated dramatically in the final decade before the Doom. Glass candles that had provided light for centuries began to fail throughout the empire, leaving vast sections of cities in darkness. The fused stone roads that had carried trade across continents developed cracks that spread with alarming speed, as if the very bonds that held the stone together were weakening. Aqueducts that had supplied water to millions of people for generations began to leak or collapse entirely, forcing communities to return to primitive water sources that could barely sustain a fraction of their populations. Communication networks that had allowed instant coordination across vast distances became increasingly unreliable. Sending stones that had functioned perfectly for centuries would suddenly go silent in the middle of important messages. Dragon-carried dispatches often failed to reach their destinations, with the great beasts sometimes returning without their riders, and no explanation for what had befallen them. The isolation that this created made it impossible for imperial authorities to coordinate responses to the mounting crises, allowing problems that might have been manageable individually to compound into disasters. The great libraries that had preserved the accumulated knowledge of ages became scenes of inexplicable destruction as scrolls and books began deteriorating at accelerated rates. Texts that had survived for millennia crumbled to dust when touched, as if time itself was suddenly catching up with materials that had been preserved by magical means. Scribes working to copy important documents reported that the ink would fade from pages faster than they could write, making the preservation of knowledge increasingly difficult, even as its importance became more obvious. Military preparedness suffered as the strange phenomena affecting the empire made traditional defense strategies obsolete. Fortifications that had stood for centuries developed structural weaknesses that appeared overnight. Weapons and armor stored in imperial arsenals were found to have lost their enchantments, rendering them no more effective than ordinary steel. Most critically, the dragon riders who formed the backbone of Valyrian military power found themselves increasingly unable to rely on their mounts as the great beasts grew more erratic and unpredictable with each passing month. International intelligence painted an increasingly grim picture of the Empire's standing in the wider world. Former allies began distancing themselves from Valyrian commitments, while old enemies showed new boldness in challenging imperial interests. Tribute that had flowed reliably from conquered territories slowed to a trickle as local authorities claimed inability to meet their obligations due to their own mounting difficulties. Some regions simply stopped responding to imperial communications entirely, effectively declaring independence through silence rather than open rebellion. As the final year before the doom began, the accumulated weight of all these warning signs created an atmosphere of desperate urgency among those few who still believed that catastrophe might be averted. Emergency sessions of the Council of 40 were called to address the mounting crises, but the assembled dragonlords found themselves paralyzed by the scope of the problems they faced and their apparent inability to develop effective responses. Some proposed radical measures such as evacuating the entire population of the peninsula, while others insisted that traditional solutions would eventually prove adequate if given sufficient time and resources. The debate continued even as the 14 Flames began their final period of ominous quiet, a geological calm that the few remaining seers recognized as the moment of greatest danger. The pressure that had been building for decades was approaching its ultimate release, and nothing in human power could prevent the catastrophe that was now only days away from transforming the greatest empire in history into nothing more than legend and ash. The morning of the 14th day of the second month dawned clear and calm across the Valyrian peninsula, with no hint in the peaceful sky of the catastrophe that would unfold before sunset. The great city of Valyria sparkled in the early sunlight, its fused stone pyramids rising like crystalline mountains from the volcanic plains, while wisps of steam from the 14 Flames painted delicate patterns against the azure heavens. In the harbor, merchant ships prepared for their daily journeys across the empire, their crews eager to take advantage of the favorable winds that promised swift passage to distant ports. Lord Arian Tueri stood on the highest balcony of his family's pyramid, surveying the domain that his ancestors had helped to build and rule for over 3,000 years. At 73, he was among the eldest of the dragonlords, old enough to remember when the empire had seemed unshakable in its power and glory. The recent troubles that had plagued Valyria struck him as temporary setbacks rather than fundamental threats, challenges that could be overcome through the same combination of wisdom, strength, and dragonfire that had carried the freehold through previous difficulties. His morning inspection of the family's dragon roosts had revealed nothing more alarming than the usual behavioral oddities that had become commonplace in recent years. His mount, the great drake Tyraxes, seemed restless but responsive, and the younger dragons showed no signs of the mysterious ailments that had claimed so many of their kind in recent months. The volcanic activity beneath the city appeared normal, with the familiar rhythmic pulsing that had powered Valyrian magic for millennia continuing its reassuring beat. In the depths of the great library, Master Kyrian was conducting his final research into the ancient texts that spoke of geological cycles and magical resonance. His calculations, derived from thousands of years of careful observation and measurement, indicated that the current period of instability was approaching its peak but would soon stabilize into a new equilibrium. He had prepared a report for the Council of 40 that outlined several measures that could help manage the transition, confident that human ingenuity and Valyrian expertise would prove equal to whatever challenges the Earth might present. The first sign that this day would be different from all others came at precisely noon, when every dragon in the city began to scream simultaneously. Not the usual roars of communication or dominance display, but sounds of pure terror and anguish that echoed off the pyramid walls and sent chills through the hearts of all who heard them. The great beasts launched themselves into the air without waiting for their riders, their movements frantic and uncoordinated as they sought to escape some threat that only they could perceive. In the underground chambers where the Empire's most powerful mages maintained the spells that regulated volcanic activity, alarms began sounding as their instruments detected energy levels that exceeded anything in their recorded experience. The careful balance of forces that had been maintained for centuries was shifting rapidly toward a critical threshold, and the magical controls that should have prevented dangerous fluctuations were failing faster than they could be repaired or replaced. Master Kerian felt the change before he understood it, a sudden sensation as if the very foundations of reality were shifting beneath his feet. The ancient scrolls he had been studying began to emit a faint luminescence, their text glowing as if heated from within, while the parchment remained cool to the touch. Around him, other scholars pointed in alarm at similar phenomena affecting documents throughout the vast library, as knowledge that had slumbered peacefully for millennia suddenly came alive with ominous energy. The volcanic system that had powered Valyrian civilization finally reached the point of catastrophic failure at noon. When the magical forces that held the 14 flames in balance suddenly reversed their polarity, instead of drawing power from the Earth's molten core to serve human purposes, the accumulated magical energy of 3,000 years began flowing back into the volcanic chambers with exponentially increasing intensity. The result was not simply an eruption, but a fundamental alteration in the nature of volcanic activity itself. Lord Orion had just enough time to realize that something unprecedented was happening before the pyramid, beneath his feet, began to shake with vibrations that seemed to come from the very core of the earth. The fused stone walls that had stood for centuries started to crack and crumble as the magical bonds that held them together dissolved under the assault of energies that no human art could contain or direct. From his high vantage point, he could see similar destruction beginning simultaneously across the entire city, as if some vast hand was methodically dismantling the greatest achievement in human history. The dragons that had fled to the sky found no safety there, as the air itself became charged with magical energies that interfered with whatever forces allowed creatures of such massive size to achieve flight. One by one, they began to fall, their great wings beating uselessly against atmosphere that no longer supported them. Some managed controlled descents that might have allowed them to survive the initial impact, but the rapidly changing magical environment proved toxic to creatures whose entire existence depended on supernatural abilities. In the great library, Master Karen watched in horror as 3 millennia of accumulated knowledge began to destroy itself. Scrolls that contained the secrets of Valyrian steel burst into flames that burned with colors never seen in natural fire. Books that recorded the breeding lines of dragons dissolved into pools of liquid that steamed and bubbled without heat. Most tragically, the living memory crystals that stored the experiences and wisdom of the greatest mages in history cracked and shattered, releasing their contents as brief flashes of light that illuminated the chamber before fading forever. The magical infrastructure that had supported the Empire's far-flung territories began to collapse as the energy sources that powered it were consumed by the growing catastrophe. Communication networks went silent across vast distances as sending stones overloaded and exploded. The great roads that had carried trade and armies across continents developed cracks that spread like lightning, their fused stone surfaces reverting to component materials in cascading waves of destruction that followed the energy flows back to their sources. The 14 flames themselves became visible from impossible distances as they erupted with a fury that dwarfed every volcanic event in recorded history. But these were not ordinary eruptions of molten rock and ash. The accumulated magical energies that had been building for centuries transformed the basic nature of the volcanic material, creating substances that burned without consuming fuel and flows of liquid fire that moved against gravity to climb the sides of pyramids and towers. Lord Orion's final moments came when the pyramid's apex, where he had spent so many peaceful mornings watching the sunrise over his domain, simply ceased to exist in any recognizable form. The fused stone didn't melt or crumble, but underwent a transformation that left it neither solid nor liquid, but something entirely new, a state of matter that human language had no words to describe. His last coherent thought was a prayer to the gods of fire and blood that his family's legacy might somehow survive the destruction of everything he had ever known. The great harbor that had welcomed ships from across the known world became a cauldron of superheated water as the magical catastrophe extended beyond the land to affect the very sea itself. Merchant vessels that had been preparing for routine voyages burst into flames that water could not extinguish. The carefully constructed breakwaters and docks that had taken centuries to build disappeared beneath waves that glowed with their own inner light and moved in patterns that defied every law of nature. Master Coron's death came more slowly, as he attempted to use his knowledge of magical theory to understand what was happening around him. His final notes, scratched hastily on a piece of stone with a fragment of melted metal, described phenomena that would have been dismissed as impossible just hours earlier. The fundamental forces that governed the interaction between magic and matter were reversing themselves, creating conditions that no living creature could survive and that would persist long after the initial catastrophe had ended. The process of destruction accelerated through the afternoon as feedback loops amplified the initial magical disturbance into something that approached the raw creative and destructive power that had shaped the world in its earliest days. The very landscape began to reshape itself as the accumulated magical energies sought new equilibrium states that bore no resemblance to anything that had existed before. Mountains collapsed into valleys that immediately filled with substances that were neither earth nor water nor fire but partook of all three elements simultaneously. The population of the peninsula, estimated at over 2 million people, including nearly 50,000 dragonlords and their families, had no opportunity to escape or even comprehend what was happening to them. The transformation occurred faster than human minds could process, faster than bodies could react, faster than even the swiftest dragons could fly. One moment they were going about their daily lives in the greatest civilization humanity had ever achieved, and the next they were part of a landscape that no longer existed in any form that living beings could inhabit. The magical energies released by the doom propagated outward from Valyria at speeds that seemed to increase rather than diminish with distance, creating destruction that reached far beyond the peninsula itself. Coastal cities across Essos reported tidal waves that burned rather than merely destroying, while settlements hundreds of miles inland experienced earthquakes that seemed to strike selectively at buildings constructed using Valyrian techniques. The very air carried traces of the magical catastrophe, creating phenomena that persisted for years and affected every corner of the known world. The final stage of the doom came as the 14 flames, their volcanic cores so overloaded with magical energy that they could no longer maintain physical coherence, imploded rather than erupted. The result was not explosion but collapse, as sections of the peninsula simply fell into voids that opened beneath them without warning. Where the great peaks had stood for millions of years, there remained only empty space that filled with water from the narrow sea, creating the body of toxic, perpetually steaming water that would become known as the Smoking Sea. As darkness fell on what had been the Valyrian Peninsula, silence settled over waters that bubbled with residual magical energy and glowed with phosphorescence that had nothing to do with natural marine life. The greatest empire in human history had been reduced to memory in the span of a single day, its cities submerged beneath waves that would remain poisonous for centuries to come. The few ships that had been far enough from the peninsula to survive the initial catastrophe reported that the very stars seemed dimmer that night, as if the destruction of Valyria had somehow wounded the heavens themselves. The doom of Valyria was complete, but its consequences would echo through history for generations to come. The magical catastrophe had not merely destroyed a civilization, but had fundamentally altered the nature of the world itself, creating conditions that would affect the development of magic, the behavior of dragons, and the rise and fall of future empires in ways that no one could yet begin to comprehend. The age of Valyrian dominance was over, leaving behind only ruins beneath the waves and the scattered remnants of dragonlord families who would carry forward whatever fragments of the old knowledge they could preserve. The first reports of the catastrophe reached the free cities, not through official channels or magical communication, But in the terrified accounts of sailors whose ships had been far enough from Valyria to survive the initial destruction, these witnesses spoke of events so impossible that many listeners dismissed their stories as the ravings of men driven mad by trauma. They described a pillar of fire that reached from earth to sky, waters that burned without consuming themselves, and a silence so profound that it seemed to swallow sound itself before it could travel more than a few yards. Captain Maester Kiban of the merchant vessel Sunset's Glory had been sailing westward from Volantis when the horizon behind his ship suddenly blazed with light that turned night into day for several minutes before fading to a sickly glow that persisted for hours. When he attempted to turn back toward the Valyrian peninsula to investigate, his crew refused to obey, claiming that the very air tasted of death and that compass needles spun wildly whenever they pointed toward their homeland. His ship was among the first to bring news of the doom to the outside world, though his account would not be believed until similar reports arrived from dozens of other vessels. The immediate aftermath in the territories that had formed the outer reaches of the Valyrian Empire was chaos on a scale that defied comprehension. Provincial governors who had ruled in the name of the freehold suddenly found themselves without instructions, without support, and without any clear understanding of what had happened to the center of their world. Some attempted to maintain order by continuing to implement existing policies, while others declared independence or simply abandoned their posts entirely to flee toward what they hoped might be safer regions. In Volantis, the largest and wealthiest of the free cities, the reaction to news of Valyria's destruction evolved through several distinct phases. Initial disbelief gave way to panic as more refugee ships arrived carrying similar accounts of unimaginable catastrophe. The triarchs who governed the city found themselves facing simultaneous challenges from within and without as various factions attempted to seize power, while external enemies sensed opportunity in the empire's sudden weakness. The delicate balance that had maintained peace for centuries collapsed within days, plunging the region into conflicts that would continue for generations. The economic consequences of the doom rippled outward, like waves from a stone dropped in still water, touching every corner of the known world within months of the catastrophe. Trade routes that had functioned reliably for centuries became impassable as the ships and infrastructure that maintained them simply disappeared. The standardized currency backed by Valyrian gold lost all value overnight, creating financial chaos in markets from the Summer Isles to the plains of Yi. Entire industries that had developed to serve the Empire's needs found themselves without customers, while others faced shortages of raw materials that could no longer be obtained from the devastated homeland. The collapse of magical infrastructure had consequences that extended far beyond the immediate destruction. Communication networks that had allowed coordination across vast distances fell silent, leaving scattered garrisons and administrative outposts isolated without hope of contact with higher authority. The great roads of fused stone began to crack and crumble as the magical forces that had bonded their materials dissipated, making travel increasingly difficult and dangerous. Aqueducts that had supplied water to millions of people failed as their enchantments wore off, forcing mass migrations toward natural water sources that could support only fractions of their original populations. Perhaps most tragically, the systematic knowledge that had taken millennia to accumulate was lost almost as completely as if it had never existed. The techniques for forging Valyrian steel died with the masters who had guarded their secrets so carefully. The breeding programs that had produced dragons optimized for specific purposes were scattered or destroyed, leaving only random survivors whose genetic heritage could not be properly traced or maintained. The magical practices that had powered Valyrian civilization became impossible to replicate as the environmental conditions that had made them possible no longer existed. The few dragons that survived the initial catastrophe found themselves in a world that could no longer support creatures of their nature and needs. Those that had been away from the peninsula when the doom occurred gradually weakened and died as their connection to the magical forces that sustained them was severed. Wild dragons that had lived in distant lands began exhibiting strange behaviors, as if they sensed that something fundamental had changed in the world's magical balance. Within a generation, dragons had become so rare that their existence was questioned by many who had not seen them personally. The Targaryen family on Dragonstone represented the largest concentration of surviving dragons anywhere in the world, but even they faced unprecedented challenges in maintaining their aerial mounts. The dragons that had made the journey to their island refuge survived the doom itself, but they showed signs of gradual decline that no amount of care could reverse. Breeding became increasingly difficult and often unsuccessful, with many eggs failing to hatch, and those that did produce often yielding creatures that were smaller and weaker than their parents. Religious and cultural upheaval followed the political and economic chaos as peoples across the former empire struggled to understand what had happened to the civilization that had dominated their world for so long. The fire worship that had spread with Valyrian expansion lost much of its appeal as the gods of flame and blood had apparently failed to protect their most devoted followers. Local religions that had been suppressed or marginalized for centuries experienced revivals as people sought new sources of spiritual comfort and explanation for the catastrophe they had witnessed. The faceless men, whose role in the events leading to the doom remained mysterious, seemed to vanish as completely as the civilization they had worked to undermine. Some theories suggested that they had achieved their ultimate purpose and disbanded, while others proposed that they had been destroyed along with their targets in the catastrophe they had helped to orchestrate. A few whispered that they had simply moved on to new objectives, perhaps planning the downfall of other empires in distant lands where their methods had not yet been recognized. Environmental damage from the doom extended far beyond the immediate area of destruction, creating problems that would persist for centuries. The smoking sea that now covered the former Valyrian peninsula continued to emit toxic vapors that affected weather patterns across Essos. Ash from the magical conflagration was carried by winds to distant regions, poisoning crops and water supplies hundreds of miles from its source. Marine life throughout the narrow sea and beyond showed signs of corruption that made fishing dangerous and reduced available food sources for coastal populations. The power vacuum created by Valyria's sudden disappearance led to a period of unprecedented warfare and political instability known as the Century of Blood. Former client states and subject peoples who had been held in check by the threat of dragon retaliation suddenly found themselves free to pursue old grievances and territorial ambitions. The careful balance of power that had maintained relative peace across much of the known world collapsed into chaos as dozens of would-be successors to Valyrian hegemony fought for dominance. In the eastern provinces of the former empire, the descendants of Old Giz began reasserting their ancient claims to the lands around Slaver's Bay. The techniques and traditions that the Valyrians had tried to destroy proved more resilient than their conquerors had imagined, and within decades new Githkari cities were rising from the ruins of the old. The Unsullied, those perfect soldiers who had served Valyrian masters for generations, found new employers among the emerging powers who recognized their value in the chaotic new world. Cultural preservation became a desperate priority for the scattered communities of Valyrian descent who had survived the catastrophe. Families who had fled the homeland before the doom, or who had been traveling abroad when it occurred, worked frantically to maintain whatever traditions and knowledge they could remember. The High Valyrian language, once the lingua franca of half the world, began to fragment into regional dialects as different communities lost contact with each other and developed their own variations. The Targaryens on Dragonstone found themselves in the unique position of being the sole remaining dragonlord family with any significant power, but their isolation from the mainland made it difficult for them to influence events across the narrow sea. They became custodians of Valyrian tradition by default, preserving customs and knowledge that might otherwise have been lost entirely. Their dragons, while diminished in number and strength, remained the only living links to the Empire's glorious past. Archaeological expeditions to the Smoking Sea began almost immediately after the Doom, driven by hopes of recovering treasure or knowledge from the submerged ruins. Most of these ventures ended in disaster as the toxic environment proved lethal to human life, while the magical contamination made traditional salvage techniques impossible. The few artifacts that were successfully recovered often proved to be cursed or dangerous, transforming into substances that harmed those who handled them. The long-term consequences of the Doom extended into realms that could not be immediately measured or understood. The magical catastrophe had altered fundamental forces that governed the interaction between natural and supernatural phenomena, creating conditions that would affect the development of magic, the behavior of fantastical creatures, and the rise and fall of future civilizations in ways that would only become apparent over centuries or millennia. Trade networks that had connected distant continents began to break down as the central coordination provided by Valyrian commerce disappeared. Without the Empire's vast merchant fleets and standardized systems of exchange, communication between far-flung regions became sporadic and unreliable. Knowledge and innovations that had spread rapidly during the height of Valyrian power now moved slowly or not at all, leading to technological and cultural stagnation in many parts of the world. The survivors of the catastrophe, whether they were refugees who had escaped the peninsula or descendants of Valyrian colonists in distant lands, carried with them a profound sense of loss and displacement that would shape their worldview for generations. They had witnessed the destruction of what they believed to be the pinnacle of human achievement, and many never fully recovered from the psychological trauma of seeing their entire civilization reduced to ash and memory in a single day. As the immediate chaos of the post-Doom period gradually settled into new patterns of conflict and cooperation, it became clear that the world had been fundamentally changed by the loss of Valyrian dominance. The age of vast, unified empires had ended, replaced by a more fragmented political landscape where smaller powers competed for regional influence rather than global hegemony. The great questions of governance, culture, and human achievement would have to be answered anew by peoples who could no longer look to Valyria as either model or master. Today, 4 centuries after the Great Catastrophe, the Smoking Sea stretches where once the mightiest empire in human history cast its shadow across half the known world. The waters that now cover the Valyrian peninsula shimmer with an otherworldly luminescence, their surface occasionally broken by the skeletal remains of dragon bones that rise like ancient monuments from the depths. These pale remnants, weathered by centuries of toxic brine, serve as the only tombstones for a civilization that once commanded the very elements themselves. Sailors who brave the dangerous waters speak in hushed tones of the sights that await those foolish or desperate enough to venture into the heart of the Smoking Sea. On clear days when the perpetual mist lifts just enough to reveal the sea floor, they claim to see the tops of pyramids still reaching upward through the poisoned depths, their fused stone surfaces now home to creatures that evolution never intended. The great roads that once carried the wealth of continents can sometimes be glimpsed beneath the waves, their perfectly fitted stones still holding together after all these years, testament to the engineering mastery of a people who learned to bend the very earth to their will. The dragon bones that occasionally wash ashore on distant coastlines have become objects of wonder and reverence across the known world. Each massive vertebra tells a story of creatures that soared through ancient skies when the world was young and magic flowed as freely as water. Children in Pentos gather fragments of dragon scale that gleam like black jewels in the sunlight, while scholars in Old Town study dragon teeth the size of swords, seeking to understand the biology of beasts that defied every natural law yet known to man. In the great libraries that survived the Empire's fall, scribes continue to copy and preserve what remains of Valyrian texts, though each generation finds the ancient High Valyrian more difficult to read as the living language slowly fades from memory. The poems and histories that survive speak of a time when men walked among wonders as casually as we might stroll through a garden, when the manipulation of fire and stone was as common as weaving cloth or forging iron. These fragments of a lost golden age inspire both wonder and melancholy in those who study them, offering glimpses of achievements that may never be equaled again. The Targaryens, last scions of the dragonlord families, have carried their heritage across the narrow sea to establish a new dynasty in Westeros. Their dragons, though much diminished from the great beasts that once darkened Valyrian skies, still represent the most tangible link to that vanished world. Each time one of these magnificent creatures takes wing above the Red Keep in King's Landing, observers are reminded that the blood of old Valyria still flows in human veins, carrying with it the memory of an age when humanity reached heights that touched the realm of gods. The lessons of Valyria echo through the corridors of power, wherever ambitious rulers dream of building empires that will last forever. Wise counselors whisper reminders that even the mightiest civilization can be brought low by the very forces that elevated it to greatness. The Valyrians mastered fire and blood, dragons and stone, yet their mastery became their doom when they pushed beyond the boundaries that nature and the gods had established. Their story serves as both inspiration and warning, showing what heights human ambition can achieve while demonstrating the terrible price of flying too close to the sun. In the temples of the Lord of Light, where flames dance in brass braziers and cast shifting shadows on ancient walls, priests still speak the old prayers in High Valyrian, though few understand the words they recite. The religion that spread across the world in the wake of Valyrian expansion has outlived the empire that carried it, adapting and evolving to serve new peoples in new lands. The sacred fires continue to burn, carrying forward the flame worship that once united millions under the banner of the freehold, transformed now into something both familiar and strange. The free cities that once served as Valyria's western outposts have grown into independent powers in their own right, each developing its own character while retaining traces of their imperial heritage. In Tyrosh, the purple dyes that once adorned dragonlord robes now color the garments of merchant princes who rule through gold rather than dragonfire. Lyce maintains its reputation for beauty and pleasure, though the elaborate festivities of the modern city pale beside the legendary celebrations of old Valyria. Miri continues to produce fine steel and intricate mechanisms, though the secrets of true Valyrian steel died with the smiths who forged it in the fires of the 14 Flames. Scholars and dreamers still venture to the edges of the smoking sea, driven by hopes of recovering some fragment of lost knowledge or treasure from the ruins beneath the waves. Most return with nothing but tales of toxic mists and waters that burn the skin, but a few claim to have glimpsed wonders that defy description. Ancient automatons of metal and magic still moving through drowned halls, books written on materials that resist both water and time. Chambers filled with dragon eggs that glow with their own inner light, waiting for conditions that may never come again. The memory of Valyria lives on in the songs of bards and the stories told by mothers to children throughout the known world. These tales, embellished through countless retellings, paint pictures of a realm where magic was as common as morning dew and dragons soared through skies painted with perpetual sunset. While the details may be lost to time and fancy, the essential truth remains unchanged. Once in a place where fire and dreams converged, humanity achieved something truly extraordinary. The great cycle of rise and fall continues in the world that Valyria left behind. New powers emerge to fill the void left by the Freehold's destruction, each believing that their strength will prove more enduring than that of their predecessors. The Iron Throne of Westeros, the merchant princes of the free cities, the Cowls of the Dothraki Sea, all play their parts in the endless dance of ambition and achievement, construction and decay. Yet none have yet approached the sheer scale and magnificence of what was lost when the 14 Flames turned their fury inward and consumed their creators. Perhaps that is as it should be. The world may not be ready for another civilization that commands such absolute power over the forces of nature. The doom of Valyria stands as eternal testimony to the truth that all earthly glory is temporary, that every empire carries within itself the seeds of its own destruction, and that even the mightiest dragons must eventually return to the earth from which they came. As you drift toward sleep tonight, let your mind wander across the gentle waves of the smoking sea, where ancient bones rest in peace beneath waters that glow with the last traces of a magic that once illuminated the world. Feel the soft ash that falls like snow in your dreams, carrying with it the memories of a civilization that burned so brightly it could be seen from the very stars themselves. The dragons may be gone, the pyramids may lie drowned beneath toxic seas, and the roads may crumble back into the stone from which they were born. But the dream of Valyria endures, eternal and unchanged, in the part of the human spirit that forever reaches toward the sky, seeking to touch the realm of gods and dragons that waits beyond the boundaries of our mortal world. Sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with the wonder of distant wings and the gentle warmth of dragonfire painting golden patterns across endless skies.